Hello there and welcome to History for Lunatics. I'm so glad you're here tonight. Settle in somewhere comfortable if you can. Maybe you have a blanket nearby, maybe a cup of tea. Maybe the room is quiet except for the soft hum of something modern, doing its job in the background. A heater, a fan, a refrigerator. The kind of ordinary sound that tells you life is still moving normally. Tonight we're going somewhere that does not begin with cannon fire, even though there is a war in the distance. It does not begin in a palace or a president's office or a laboratory where a great discovery is about to be made. It begins much closer than that. It begins at a kitchen table. It begins beside a bed. It begins in the hallway of an ordinary American house in the autumn of 1918, when someone behind a closed door starts coughing and the whole family goes still. Because that is the thing about the 1918 flu pandemic that is so easy to forget when we talk about it in numbers. We say millions. We say waves. We say mortality rate. We say influenza, as if the word itself is neat and manageable, as if history can be folded into a chart and placed safely behind glass. But for ordinary Americans, it did not arrive as a statistic. It arrived as a sound, a cough from the next room, a feverish child turning in bed, a husband coming home early from the streetcar with his collar damp and his eyes too bright, a mother touching a forehead and realizing, before she says a word, that the day has changed, the house has changed, the future has narrowed into the next few hours. And here is what makes this story so unsettling. The people living through it did not have the tools we would expect them to have. There was no flu vaccine waiting in a clinic. There were no antibiotics to treat the bacterial pneumonia that so often followed the infection. There were no antiviral drugs, no home oxygen machines, no intensive care units ready to take the worst cases and hold them between life and death with machinery. There were doctors, yes, exhausted doctors. There were nurses, brave beyond easy description. There were public health officers issuing orders as fast as they could understand what was happening. But inside the average home, when the fever came through the door, survival often depended on things that sound almost heartbreakingly simple. A clean sheet, a bowl of broth, a basin of cool water, a neighbour willing to come over when everyone else was afraid, a mother staying awake through the night, listening to the breathing of the person in the bed. Before we go further, let me ask you something. Where are you listening from tonight? Are you at home, in a room that feels safe and familiar? Is there someone sleeping nearby? Someone you would check on if you heard them cough too long? I ask because this is not just a story about a disease. It is a story about what people do when the ordinary walls of life suddenly become the front line. And if this kind of storytelling speaks to you, if you find yourself settling in and feeling that quiet pull of history, it would mean the world to me if you hit that subscribe button and give this video a like. You do not have to do it right now. Do it when you feel it. When something in this story makes you pause or think about your own family or look differently at the simple comfort of a healthy breath in a quiet room. And if you want to share where you're watching from, your city, your country, your couch, your kitchen, some corner of the world I may never have seen, leave it in the comments. I genuinely love reading those. Now, dim the lights a little if you can, and let us go back to the United States in 1918. It is a country already holding its breath. The First World War is still raging across the ocean. American soldiers are moving through camps and ports and troop ships in enormous numbers. Train stations are crowded. Factories are running hard. Posters on walls tell people to buy Liberty bonds, save wheat, save meat, save fuel, support the boys over there. There is a wartime seriousness in the air, the kind that makes ordinary complaints feel almost disloyal. People are used to sacrifice by now. They have learned to stretch sugar, to read casualty lists, to watch young men leave town in uniform while bands play and mothers wave with handkerchiefs. They try not to soak with tears. The country thinks it understands emergency. Then the sickness comes. At first, for many people, it is just influenza. That word did not carry the same weight at the beginning. Flu was familiar. People had had flu before. It came in winter, made you miserable, put you in bed, and then, usually you recovered. Doctors knew influenza could be dangerous, especially for the old, the very young, and the already weak. But this was different in ways that became clear only after it had already entered houses, barracks, boarding rooms, apartment buildings, farm kitchens, and city tenements. This flu moved with terrifying speed. A person could wake in the morning feeling well enough to work and be desperately ill by evening. A strong young man could report a headache at noon, develop a fever by supper, and by the next day be struggling for breath. In some cases, the skin darkened from lack of oxygen, turning lips and cheeks a bluish colour that frightened even experienced nurses. People called it the blue death in some places, because it looked less like ordinary influenza and more like something that had reached inside the lungs and stolen the air directly. The fall of 1918 was the season Americans would remember most sharply. There had been an earlier wave in the spring, milder in many places, serious enough in military camps but not yet the national nightmare that was coming. By late summer and early autumn, the deadlier wave was moving through the country. It travelled the way people travelled, by rail, by ship, by streetcar, by crowded workplace, by military movement, by church gathering, by parade, by the touch of a hand on a doorknob, by a conversation held too close in a store, by a cough released into the air before anyone fully understood how much danger could sit inside an ordinary breath. In a country built on movement, the disease found roads everywhere. Picture a town in September or October of 1918. Not a famous town, not one that will become a case study a century later. Just an ordinary town with a main street, a drugstore, a schoolhouse, a few churches, a train depot, a barber shop, a post office, maybe a movie theatre if it is large enough, maybe a newspaper office where one or two men are trying to keep up with the war news and the death notices at the same time. The mornings still begin with routine, coal deliveries, children hurrying with books, women stepping into shops with baskets, men in work clothes moving toward mills, offices, warehouses, docks, streetcars, farms. The American day is still trying to behave like an American day. But there is something underneath it now. A rumour, a warning, a headline, a notice from the health department. A neighbour who was perfectly fine 3 days ago and is now gone. That is how fear spreads in ordinary places, not all at once, not as a dramatic announcement. It spreads by interruption. The school closes, then church services are suspended, then the theatre goes dark, then the undertaker cannot keep up. Then the woman down the street ties a strip of gauze over her face before stepping outside, and someone laughs at her, and 2 days later the person who laughed is in bed with fever. Public health officers began telling people to avoid crowds, to cover coughs and sneezes, to isolate the sick, to keep windows open, to use disinfectant, to stop gathering in the ways that made a community feel like itself. In some places, masks became mandatory for workers who dealt with the public. In some cities, streetcar passengers and employees wore them. Schools, theatres, dance halls, churches, saloons, pool rooms, and public meetings were closed or restricted depending on where you lived and how quickly officials acted. But orders on paper and life in a household are two very different things. Because imagine being told to isolate the sick when your entire family lives in 4 rooms. Imagine being told to avoid crowds when your job is on a factory floor. Imagine being told to stay home when staying home means no wages, and no wages means no coal, no rent, no food. Imagine being a mother in a city apartment with 3 children, 1 bed for the boys, 1 bed for the girls, and a baby who still needs to be held, while the newspapers tell you fresh air is important, and the weather outside is turning cold. Advice could be sensible and still be hard to obey. That is one of the things ordinary Americans discovered very quickly in 1918. Surviving a pandemic was not only a matter of knowing what to do, it was a matter of having enough room, enough money, enough help, enough time, and enough luck to do it. Luck. That word belongs in this story more than we might like. There were families who did everything they were told and still lost someone. There were houses where nearly everyone became ill at once, leaving no one strong enough to cook, wash bedding, fetch medicine, or sit upright long enough to keep the fire going. There were children who woke to find both parents too weak to rise. There were boarding houses where sickness moved from room to room with no respect for curtains or closed doors. There were farms where the chores could not stop because animals still needed feeding, cows still needed milking, and autumn work still had to be finished even if the person doing it had chills running through his body. There were immigrant neighbourhoods where families already living under suspicion during wartime had to navigate illness while also facing language barriers, poverty, and the hard edge of official authority. There were black communities forced to survive with fewer hospitals, fewer resources, and a segregated medical system that made danger even more dangerous. The flu did not strike a fair country. It entered the country that already existed, with all its inequalities waiting. Still, people survived in the ways people do when no perfect rescue is coming. They improvised. They obeyed when they could, ignored rules when they had to, argued when orders felt unfair, and leaned on one another in ways that were both brave and messy. They turned bedrooms into sick rooms. They hung sheets to separate the infected from the well. They boiled water. They opened windows even when the air was cold. They washed floors with disinfectant strong enough to sting the nose. They burned or washed handkerchiefs. They made masks out of gauze, cotton, or whatever material was available. Some well-made, some almost useless, but all carrying the same hope that a barrier, any barrier, might stand between one breath and another. They put signs on doors. They whispered on porches. They left food outside for families inside. They took in children when a neighbour could not manage them. They watched the mail for letters from soldiers and the newspaper for names of the dead, both lists growing in the same season, war and illness braided together until many Americans could barely separate one grief from the other. There is a photograph from that period that stays with people once they see it. A mail carrier wearing a mask. It is such a simple image, almost ordinary at first glance. A man still doing his route, still carrying letters, still walking through streets where families are waiting for news from sons overseas and bills and postcards and official notices and everything else that makes a country keep functioning. But the mask changes the entire meaning of the image. It says the world has become unsafe, but the mail must still come. That was 1918 in miniature. The world was unsafe, and yet the milk wagon came if the driver was well enough. The streetcar ran if the crew could stand. The newspaper printed if enough men made it to the office. The hospital opened its doors even when its own nurses collapsed. Ordinary systems did not stop because they were designed to stop gently. They staggered forward, held together by tired people, and those tired people were everywhere. In Boston, New York, Philadelphia, San Francisco, Seattle, Chicago, St. Louis, Baltimore, small towns in Kansas, mining communities in Pennsylvania, farms in Iowa, mill villages in New England. The same basic drama repeated with local variations. The names changed, the weather changed, the rules changed, the timing changed. But the household fear was familiar. Someone came home ill. Someone sent for a doctor. The doctor might arrive hours later, or not at all. If he came, he could offer advice. Perhaps aspirin, perhaps a cough mixture, perhaps a warning to keep the patient warm and quiet, perhaps a grave look that told the family more than his words did. Families used home remedies because home was where most illness was treated. They rubbed chests. They brewed teas. They made poultices. They tried patent medicines sold by druggists who were sometimes sincere, sometimes opportunistic, and often just as frightened as everyone else. They prayed, they waited, they counted breaths. The waiting may have been the hardest part. We tend to imagine crisis as action, people running, bells ringing, doctors shouting instructions. But so much of sickness inside a home is waiting. Waiting for the fever to break, waiting for the cough to ease, waiting for the breathing to steady, waiting for the person in the bed to wake and recognize you, waiting through the long hour after midnight when the rest of the house seems to hold its breath along with the patient. In 1918, that waiting was made worse by uncertainty. People did not know whether the worst moment had passed or was only beginning. A patient might improve and then suddenly worsen with pneumonia. Someone could appear to be recovering, then decline. The line between survival and death could feel cruelly thin, and yet even in that fear, life retained its small practical demands. That is something history often misses because practicality is not dramatic on the page, but it mattered deeply. If someone was sick, who washed the bedding? Who emptied the basin? Who cooked for the children? Who informed the employer? Who brought in coal? Who kept the baby away from the bed? Who made sure the patient drank water? Who sat up when everyone else fell asleep? In many homes, the answer was women. Mothers, wives, sisters, daughters, neighbours. Women who were already carrying the ordinary burden of domestic labour, and now had the extra burden of nursing without training, without rest, and often without protection. A woman might move from one bed to another in her own house, checking 3 sick children and a husband while trying not to become ill herself, though the disease did not honour effort. If she fell, the whole household could collapse around her. There were organised helpers too, and their work deserves attention. The American Red Cross, already mobilised for war, redirected volunteers toward the influenza emergency. Women who had been making surgical dressings for soldiers began making gauze masks. Volunteers cooked, carried supplies, met nurses at train stations, delivered food, and helped households that were too sick to help themselves. Nurses were in desperately short supply, partly because so many had gone into military service, and partly because the pandemic created more need than any system could meet. In some cities, motor corps volunteers drove nurses from house to house so they could save their strength for the work that only they could do. That detail is easy to pass over, but sit with it for a moment. A nurse stepping out of an automobile again and again carrying supplies, entering one sick room after another, knowing each doorway might expose her, knowing the next house would need her just as badly as the last. It is difficult to imagine the exhaustion of that month without reducing it to a word too small for the reality. There were also acts of fear that do not look noble. People avoided sick neighbours. Some refused to enter infected homes. Some broke quarantine because they needed wages or simply could not bear confinement. Some protested masks or mocked them. Some officials acted too late because closing public life was economically painful and politically unpopular. Some newspapers minimised the danger, partly because wartime censorship and morale shaped what could be said openly, and partly because no community wanted to admit how bad things were until the evidence was too large to hide. Ordinary Americans were not saints in 1918, they were people. They were generous and selfish, disciplined and reckless, frightened and stubborn, sometimes in the same day. That is what makes the story human. One of the strangest parts of that autumn was the collision between public silence and private catastrophe. Outside, there might still be flags, bond drives, military posters and patriotic speeches. Inside, families were boiling sheets and listening for breath. Outside, officials might say the situation was under control. Inside, the undertaker's wagon might be stopping on the same street twice in one morning. Outside, war news still filled the front page. Inside, a mother might be folding the clothes of a son who survived the trenches, only to die of influenza in a camp hospital before reaching Europe. The pandemic did not replace the war. It entered the war and made a second battlefield out of homes, barracks, ships, schools and streets. In Philadelphia, the disaster became one of the most remembered examples of what delay could cost. A large Liberty Loan Parade went forward in late September 1918, drawing huge crowds into the streets while influenza was already spreading. Within days, the city's hospitals were overwhelmed, and the death toll rose with horrifying speed. In St. Louis, officials moved more aggressively to limit gatherings, and the city fared better by comparison. These examples would later become part of the public health memory of the pandemic, but ordinary people did not live inside the future lesson. They lived inside the immediate confusion. Should they go to the parade? Should they open the shop? Should they send the child to school if school was still open? Should they visit a sick relative? Should they wear the mask even if others laughed? Should they trust the notice on the wall, the doctor down the street, the newspaper, the mayor, their own fear? Now, I want to pause here and ask you to imagine something very simple. Imagine waking up tomorrow and finding your town quieter than it should be. Not abandoned, not destroyed, just quieter. The school bell does not ring. The church doors are closed. The theatre sign is dark. The neighbour who always sweeps his steps is not outside. The streetcar passes with masked faces in the windows. At the drugstore, people stand a little farther apart, though no one is quite sure how far is enough. Someone has posted a warning about coughing and spitting. Someone else has written a name in black-bordered type for the obituary column. The world has not ended. That is almost the cruelest thing. It continues, but everything ordinary has acquired a shadow. That was the world many Americans learned to inhabit. A world where survival meant shrinking life down to essentials: food, heat, distance, cleanliness, care, sleep when possible, work when necessary, news when it could be trusted, hope when there was reason for it, and sometimes when there was not. Families learned to read symptoms the way farmers read weather. A flushed face, a sudden chill, a dry cough, a headache that came too fast. They learned to listen to the quality of breathing. They learned which neighbours had room to help, which had sickness already, which had a telephone, which had a car, which had lost someone and should not be asked for more unless there was no other choice. Communities became maps of need. The emotional weight of that mapping is hard to measure. Suppose you are well and the family next door is sick. You hear the children crying through the wall or across the yard. You know they need food. You know you might be carrying danger back into your own home if you go inside. What do? Some people left baskets at the door, some stepped in anyway. Some wrote notes and pushed them through cracks. Some tied cloth around their faces and hoped courage could be stitched out of gauze. There was no perfect moral answer that protected everyone. Ordinary people had to make decisions with incomplete knowledge and then live with the consequences. In rural America, the pandemic had its own kind of loneliness. A family on a farm might be miles from the nearest doctor. The roads might be muddy. The telephone, if they had one, might not bring help quickly enough. If the father became sick during harvest or livestock work, the family's survival could be threatened in ways beyond the disease itself. Crops did not wait because a household had fever. Cows did not stop needing milking because a mother had chills. Children on farms often had to take on adult tasks suddenly, not as a lesson in character, but because hunger and winter were practical enemies. A 12-year-old boy might be sent to feed animals while his older sister boiled water and tried to keep the younger children quiet. A grandmother might move in to help and become ill herself. In towns, people feared crowds. On farms, people feared distance. Both could be deadly. Inside cities, closeness became the problem. Tenements, boarding houses, factory districts, and working-class neighbourhoods made isolation difficult. Many wage earners could not simply stop. Domestic servants still cooked and cleaned for other households. Streetcar conductors still handled coins and straps. Store clerks still spoke to hundreds of customers. Telephone operators, many of them young women, worked through waves of illness because communication itself had become a public necessity. If too many operators fell sick, calls for doctors, nurses, undertakers and supplies could be delayed. The pandemic revealed something Americans had always depended on, but rarely honoured properly. The everyday workers who kept the machinery of life moving were also the ones most exposed when life became dangerous. There is something deeply revealing about which jobs could disappear and which could not. Entertainment could be closed. Public meetings could be banned. Schools could be shuttered. But someone still had to deliver milk. Someone still had to collect bodies. Someone still had to print notices. Someone still had to drive the ambulance. Someone still had to sit beside the patient whose family was too sick or too frightened to do it alone. The flu pandemic forced Americans to see, however briefly, that survival was not built only on doctors and officials. It was built on a web of ordinary labour, much of it poorly paid, much of it done by women, immigrants, black workers, working-class men, and volunteers whose names would not be remembered. By October 1918, in many communities, death had become too frequent for old rituals to hold. This may be the most painful part to understand. Americans were used to death being public in certain ways. Families sat with the dying, bodies were washed and prepared, neighbours came to the house, funerals gathered people together. Mourning had a structure. It gave grief a place to go. But during the pandemic, gathering could spread disease. Funeral services were shortened, restricted, or sometimes impossible. Undertakers were overwhelmed. Coffins ran short in some places. Gravediggers became scarce because they too were sick or exhausted. Families who had expected to mourn surrounded by community sometimes found themselves alone, or nearly alone, with a loss too large for the small permission the moment allowed. This was one of the quiet cruelties of the pandemic. It did not only take lives, it damaged the rituals that helped people survive losing them. But this opening part of the story is not only about death. It cannot be, because ordinary Americans did survive. Most people who became sick did live. Most houses that fell silent eventually heard footsteps again. Most families who spent nights listening to fevered breathing also experienced the strange, cautious relief of a patient asking for water in a stronger voice, or sitting up for the first time, or complaining about being hungry. Recovery was not dramatic. It often arrived as a small change, a lower fever, a steadier breath. A person sleeping naturally instead of collapsing into illness. A child asking when school would reopen. A father standing at the doorway wrapped in a blanket, too weak to work but alive. These moments mattered enormously. They were not statistics either. They were private miracles, small enough to fit inside a bedroom and large enough to keep a family from breaking. What did survival feel like? Not triumph, most of the time, more like exhaustion. Relief mixed with guilt. Gratitude mixed with fear that another wave might come. The strange task of returning to normal when normal had not been waiting unchanged. A woman might wash the bedding after her husband recovered and find herself crying into the water without knowing exactly why. A child might pass a closed house and remember that someone there did not recover. A shopkeeper might reopen and see empty places where familiar customers should have stood. Church bells might ring again, but the congregation would be thinner. Schools might reopen, but some desks would remain unused. The pandemic left spaces in ordinary life, and ordinary people had to walk around them. For now, though, we're still at the beginning. The fever has come home. The door has closed. The family inside does not yet know whether this will be a mild illness, a dangerous one, or the dividing line between before and after. Outside, the town is beginning to change its habits. Notices are going up. Masks are being sewn. Public rooms are being locked. Doctors are being called faster than they can answer. Nurses are stepping into houses with their bags and tired eyes. Neighbours are deciding how brave they can afford to be. And inside one ordinary American home, someone is folding a clean cloth, setting a cup beside the bed, and listening closely to the sound of a breath that has suddenly become the most important sound in the world. The first cough in a house does not sound like history. It does not announce itself with the weight that later generations will place on it. It is just a cough. A small break in the ordinary sound of the room. A man clearing his throat beside the stove. A child coughing once into the sleeve of a nightshirt. A young woman turning away from the supper table because a dry tickle has caught somewhere in her chest. In another season, in another year, nobody would have stopped what they were doing for long. Someone might have said, "You're catching cold," and handed over a cup of tea, or told the child to move away from the draught, or blamed the weather. because Americans in 1918 still lived close to weather in a way many of us do not. Damp socks, cold rooms, crowded streetcars, open windows, overheated workplaces, all of it could be blamed for a cough. But by the autumn of 1918, a cough had become a question, and once a family began asking that question, nothing in the house felt entirely innocent anymore. The cup the sick person drank from, the towel hanging near the basin, the door handle, the pillowcase, the handkerchief folded in a pocket, the air itself. What had been ordinary only an hour earlier now seemed to carry meaning. A cough in October of 1918 did not remain a cough for long inside the minds of people who had been reading newspapers, hearing church bells, watching neighbours disappear behind quarantine notices, and seeing the words influenza and pneumonia printed beside names they recognised. Let us place ourselves inside one ordinary American home, not because every home was the same, but because the smaller we make the scene, the more clearly we can understand what this pandemic actually asked of people. It is evening, somewhere in the fall of 1918. The house might be in a working-class neighbourhood in Philadelphia, or a mill town in Massachusetts, or a railroad town in Ohio, or a farm county in Kansas, where the nearest doctor is several miles away. The exact place matters, but the feeling inside the room would have been familiar across the country. There is a family trying to finish the day. The war is still present in the house, even if no soldier is there. Maybe there is a service flag in the window with a blue star for a son overseas. Maybe there is a Liberty Bond poster on the wall at the post office that everyone has passed all week. Maybe there is a newspaper folded on a chair, its front page divided between war dispatches and local influenza notices. People are tired. They have already spent the day making decisions that used to require no thought. Whether to go to the market, whether to let the children play outside, whether to ride the streetcar, whether to attend a funeral, whether to believe the town officials when they say there is no cause for panic, even as the undertaker's wagon turns the corner again. Inside this house, supper is not grand. It is whatever the household can manage after a day shaped by wartime prices, work schedules, rationing habits, and worry. Perhaps there is soup, bread, potatoes, coffee stretched thin, maybe milk if the delivery came, maybe apples from a barrel, maybe nothing hot at all if the woman of the house has been out nursing someone else, or standing in line too long for supplies. The children are quieter than usual because they can feel the adults watching the world differently. Children know when grown people are pretending not to be afraid. They may not understand the reason, but they know the atmosphere. They know when a mother lowers her voice in the doorway. They know when a father reads the same paragraph in the paper twice. They know when a neighbour knocks and nobody invites her inside. Then someone coughs. Maybe it is the oldest daughter. She is 17, old enough to work, old enough to help run the house, old enough to be treated as almost grown when labour is needed, and still young when protection is discussed. She's been on her feet all day in a department store, or a telephone exchange, or a factory making uniforms, or a laundry where steam and damp cloth fill the air. She came home saying she was only tired. Everyone is tired now. Tired has become a national condition. But then she pushes her bowl away. Her face looks flushed in a way that is not from heat. She says her head hurts. Her back aches. She is cold even though the room is warm enough. A hand goes to her forehead, and the person who touches her does not need a thermometer to know something is wrong. In 1918, thermometers existed, of course, but not every household had one, and even where one was available, the first judgment was often made by touch. Mothers knew fever by touch. Wives knew fever by the sudden dry heat of a husband's skin. Sisters knew it by the way a younger child leaned too heavily against them. Fever changed a person's presence in the room. It made the eyes shine. It made speech slow. It made a strong person seem briefly unfamiliar. And the influenza of 1918 could come on with a speed that made that unfamiliarity terrifying. Many people described being struck down suddenly, as if the body had been overtaken in a matter of hours. A headache, chills, muscle pain, cough, fever, exhaustion, and then, for the unlucky, the deeper trouble in the lungs that could turn ordinary breathing into work. This is the moment when the household begins dividing itself. Not officially at first, not with perfect procedure. No one in an ordinary home had a printed checklist on the table telling them how to manage an airborne virus, secondary pneumonia, contaminated linens, frightened children, lost wages, and the emotional burden of not knowing who would be next. They had advice, and some of it was good. Keep the sick person apart if possible. Avoid crowds. Keep the room clean and ventilated. Cover coughs. Wash hands. Do not share cups or towels. Call a doctor if the case seems severe. But advice is always neater than a house. Advice does not have to find a spare bed. Advice does not have to explain to a 5-year-old why she cannot climb beside her sister. Advice does not have to decide whether the sick room should be the parents' bedroom, the children's room, or the front parlour where there is more air but less privacy. So the family acts quickly, because illness forces decisions even when no one feels ready to make them. The sick daughter is helped away from the table. The chair scrapes against the floor. Someone gathers the dishes she touched and carries them to the wash basin with a new seriousness. A younger child starts to follow and is pulled back. No, stay here. The words come sharper than intended and the child's face changes. That is another small wound of a pandemic. The language of care begins to sound like rejection. Do not come close. Do not touch her. Do not go in there. Stay away from the bed. These are loving commands, but to the frightened person hearing them, they can feel cold. The room chosen for the sick person might be the smallest bedroom, or a corner screened off with a sheet, or the only bedroom in the house if that is all there is. In crowded homes, especially in cities and boarding houses, true isolation was almost impossible. Many working families lived in apartments where rooms opened into one another, where siblings shared beds, where fresh air came through windows facing alleys, where one sick person could not be separated from the rest except by habit and hope. But families tried. They closed a door if they had one. They opened a window if the weather allowed, because fresh air was widely believed to help, and in many cases did reduce the closeness of the sick room. They moved a chair beside the bed. They set down a basin, a towel, a cup, perhaps a bottle of medicine from the drugstore, perhaps aspirin, perhaps cough syrup, perhaps something with a label promising relief in language more confident than the contents deserved. The closed door became one of the strongest images of the pandemic inside ordinary homes. It was not only a practical barrier, it changed the emotional shape of the house. Behind the door was fever, coughing, restless sleep, whispered instructions, the smell of sweat and disinfectant, sometimes the sour odour of sickness in bedding that had to be changed again and again. Outside the door was the family waiting, listening, working, trying not to listen too obviously. The door divided the house into those who were sick and those who were not yet sick, those who could enter and those who were told to stay back, those who had to be brave in the room and those who had to be brave in the hallway. The person who entered most often was usually a woman. A mother, a wife, a sister, an aunt, a daughter, old enough to help, a neighbour who had already had influenza and believed herself less likely to catch it again, though nobody could be fully sure. The sick room required labour constantly. Water had to be brought. The patient had to be encouraged to drink because fever dried the body quickly. Bedding had to be changed when sweat soaked through the sheets. The chamber pot had to be emptied. The face had to be wiped. The room had to be aired. The coughing person needed handkerchiefs or cloths, and those cloths had to be washed, boiled, burned, or at least kept away from others. If the patient became delirious, someone had to sit close enough to keep them from rising or pulling off covers. If the fever climbed, someone had to notice. If the breathing changed, someone had to understand that the situation had become more serious, and that breathing was what families learned to fear. Influenza itself was frightening, but in 1918 the complication that terrified households was pneumonia. People might say a person had the flu, and then the doctor might say pneumonia had set in, and that phrase carried a gravity everyone understood. Pneumonia meant the lungs were involved. It meant the sick person might cough painfully, struggle for air, develop a blue or dusky look around the lips and cheeks. In the worst cases, families watched someone become slowly starved for oxygen without having a modern way to reverse it. There was no ambulance rushing toward a hospital with equipment that could reliably take over the work of breathing. There were hospitals, but many were overflowing, and many people were treated at home because there was nowhere else to go or no way to get there. The house became the ward, the bed became the hospital bed, the family became the first line of care. Imagine the mother sitting beside that bed in the first night of illness. The lamp is low because fuel and electricity, depending on the home, still cost money, and because sick rooms at night have always seemed to require a different kind of quiet. She has been told to wear a mask, or maybe she's made one herself from gauze, folding it across her nose and mouth, tying it behind her head. The mask grows damp from her own breath. It itches. It makes her feel slightly foolish and slightly safer at the same time. She dips a cloth in cool water and places it on the patient's forehead. The daughter mutters something about work or asks whether the store is closed, or says she must get up because she cannot lose her wages. That is one of the cruelest practical realities of the pandemic. Fever did not erase the fear of unemployment. Illness did not pay rent. A person could be too weak to stand and still anxious about missing a shift. The mother says, "Rest now." It is the only instruction she can give with certainty. Outside the sick room, the rest of the family waits in pieces. The father may be in the kitchen, not because he does not care, but because houses have duties even when someone is ill. Coal must be brought in. A fire must be managed. Smaller children must be fed. If he has work in the morning, he has to decide whether to go. That decision could tear at a man in 1918. Stay home and lose wages, perhaps lose the job, perhaps fail to buy food. Go to work and risk carrying infection to others, or returning to find the illness worse. Many men had no paid sick leave, no cushion, no employer willing to be patient during a crisis that was already straining production. Wartime industry made absence feel like failure. Patriotism and necessity both pushed people out the door. Disease pushed them back inside. Children understood less, but felt more than adults often noticed. A younger boy might sit at the table with a schoolbook open, even though school has been closed and nobody expects him to study. A little girl might ask whether her sister will die, because children in 1918 had less protection from the fact of death than many children do now. They heard adults speak of it. They saw crepe on doors. They attended funerals before the banns, or watched funeral wagons pass after them. They knew that people could be well, and then not be there anymore. The answer they receive depends on the adult and the household. Some parents reassure too quickly. Some tell the truth too plainly. Some say, "We are doing everything we can," which is both honest and insufficient. The child learns that adults can be frightened too, and that realization is its own kind of coming of age. In many communities, when influenza entered a home, the outside world marked it. A placard might be placed on the house to warn others that disease was inside. Quarantine signs were not new in American public health. They had been used for scarlet fever, diphtheria, smallpox, and other contagious diseases. During the 1918 pandemic, local rules varied, but the idea was familiar. The house was now known publicly as a place to avoid. That sign could protect neighbours, but it could also isolate the family in a way that felt almost shameful. Imagine looking through the front window and seeing people notice the sign, slow down, and cross the street. Imagine needing help and knowing the very notice that warned people away might keep them from knocking. Public health works through distance, but human survival often works through closeness. In 1918, families had to live inside that contradiction. The doctor, if one came, might arrive carrying a black bag and the exhaustion of too many houses. He would have been moving from patient to patient, often without enough time, sometimes with little more to offer than examination, instructions and presents. We should not underestimate the value of presence. In a house full of fear, a doctor's arrival could steady people even when he could not cure the disease. He might listen to the lungs, he might take the pulse, he might ask when the fever began. He might warn the family to keep the patient in bed even if she felt better, because relapse or pneumonia could follow. He might recommend fluids, rest, warmth, fresh air, and careful nursing. He might leave medicine, though medicine in that moment was often aimed at comfort rather than cure. He might be called away before anyone felt ready for him to go. Then the family would hear the front door close, and the house would feel larger and emptier than before. This is one of the quiet truths of the pandemic. Much of survival happened after the professional left. Doctors and nurses were essential, but there were never enough of them. The long hours belonged to families. A nurse might come for a visit and explain how to position the patient, how to change the bedding, how to keep the room aired without chilling the body, how to disinfect dishes, how to watch for signs of danger. Then she had to leave for the next case. The family remained. They became apprentices to emergency. By the second day, they knew the rhythm of the fever. By the third, they knew which floorboards creaked outside the sick room door. They knew how long the patient slept after a coughing fit. They knew the exact sound of the spoon against the cup when broth was being stirred at 2 a.m. Broth mattered. So did water, tea, milk if the stomach could tolerate it, soft foods when appetite returned. Feeding the sick was one of the few things families could do that felt useful. A pot simmering on the stove gave the household a task and therefore a kind of structure. Beef tea, chicken broth, toast soaked in milk, gruel, eggs, oranges if available. Anything that seemed nourishing and gentle might be offered. In cities, volunteers delivered soup or prepared food for families too sick to cook. In many homes, the same woman who sat by the bed also cooked, cleaned, washed, and tried to keep everyone else from touching the wrong thing. The sick room was not separate from the kitchen. It depended on it. There were disinfectants too, and their smells belonged to the memory of the pandemic. Carbolic acid, chloride of lime, formaldehyde fumigation in some official settings, strong soaps, boiling water, sharp chemical odours that made cleanliness feel almost visible. People were told to clean surfaces, air rooms, avoid spitting, use individual towels and dishes when possible. Some of this advice was practical. Some rituals of disinfection gave people a sense of control beyond what they truly had. That does not make them foolish. In a house where a daughter's breathing is worsening and the doctor cannot return until morning, scrubbing a basin can become an act of defiance. It says there is still something to do. There is still some line that can be held. The sick person experiences the house differently. Fever makes familiar rooms strange. The ceiling above the bed may seem too far away, then too close. Voices come through the door, muffled and distant. The patient hears the household organising itself around her absence. The younger children are hushed. The father asks where something is kept. A pan drops in the kitchen. Someone whispers. Someone cries and is told to stop because the patient will hear. She does hear. Sick rooms are full of things people think are hidden. In 1918, many patients knew they were dangerous to the people caring for them. That knowledge added a moral burden to illness. To be sick was not only to suffer, it was to become a possible source of suffering for the people you loved. That's a hard thing to carry from a bed. Some patients tried to apologise for coughing. Some resisted being kept apart. Some begged for family members to come close. Some, in delirium, called for people who were not there or already dead. Families had to decide when comfort was worth the risk. A mother might keep a little child from entering all day, then finally allow one glance from the doorway because the crying had become unbearable. A husband might be told not to kiss his wife and do it anyway. A sister might slip into the room after being warned away because fear can make obedience feel impossible. Disease control depends on discipline, but family life is made of attachments that do not always obey discipline. This was not ignorance. It was love under pressure. As the hours passed, the house began to reorganize around the closed door. Meals became irregular. Sleep became shallow. People spoke in low voices without agreeing to. The clock mattered because medicine, fluids, temperature checks and doctor visits gave the day a new schedule. But time also lost shape. A night spent beside a sick bed can feel longer than an entire ordinary week. The lamp burns down, the patient sleeps, wakes, coughs, sleeps again. The caretaker dozes in the chair and startles awake at a change in breathing. Outside, a wagon passes. A dog barks. Somewhere nearby, another family is living through the same night. That knowledge may comfort or frighten, depending on how tired you are. The neighbours are part of the story even when they do not enter the house. Someone may leave food on the porch. Someone may take the smaller children for an afternoon if the household believes they are still well. Someone may refuse, not out of cruelty but out of terror. Someone may offer to send word to relatives. Someone may lend a thermometer, a hot water bottle, extra sheets, clean night clothes, a jar of preserves, a bottle of disinfectant. The exchange of objects becomes a language of care when bodies cannot safely meet. A basket left at the door says, "We have not forgotten you." A note folded under a cup says, "Tell us what you need." A knock followed by retreating footsteps says, "We are afraid, but we came as close as we could." For immigrant families, the sick room might also become a place where old country remedies met American public health warnings. A grandmother might prepare a treatment she learned decades earlier across an ocean. A local doctor might dismiss it. The family might use both. Mustard plasters, camphor, onion poultices, herbal teas, steam, hot bricks wrapped in cloth, patent medicines from the druggist, prayer cards, rosaries, Bible readings, whispered psalms, all could exist in the same room. It is easy for modern people to mock remedies that did little against influenza, but that misses something important. Care is not only cure. When cure is unavailable, care becomes the form love takes. The warm cloth, the broth, the prayer, the adjusted pillow, the opened window, the hand held despite fear, these were not nothing. They were the human part of medicine when medicine had reached its limits. In some homes, the first cough did not remain alone. That was the fear waiting in every hallway. One person sick could be managed if the others stayed well. Two made the house unstable. Three could overwhelm it. If the mother became ill, everything changed. If both parents went down, neighbours or relatives had to step in. Newspapers from the period carried appeals for volunteers precisely because households could collapse so quickly. A family might be too sick to call for help. Children might be found hungry beside parents too weak to rise. These were not imaginary scenes invented after the fact for drama. Public health workers, nurses and relief volunteers encountered them in real communities, and the stories spread because they revealed the raw vulnerability of households that normally seemed self-sufficient. There is something humbling about that. We like to imagine the home as a fortress, the private place where a family can close the door against the world. In 1918, the closed door did not always protect the family from danger. Sometimes it hid the danger inside. Sometimes it prevented help from arriving soon enough. Sometimes it became the thin wooden line between a sick room and a frightened kitchen, where everyone waited for news from 10 feet away. The home was still shelter, but it was not invincible. The pandemic exposed the fact that every household, no matter how proud, depended on a wider circle. Doctors, nurses, neighbours, grocers, coal dealers, milk drivers, telephone operators, undertakers, health officers, volunteers. The family waiting inside was never truly alone, but it could feel terribly alone in the hours before help came. By the second or third day, the illness began to reveal its direction. In mild cases, the fever might begin to break. The patient would sleep more naturally. The cough might remain, the weakness could last, but the household could feel the first cautious loosening of fear. No one trusted it immediately. Relief in 1918 had to be handled carefully, like a cup filled too close to the rim. Families had heard too many stories of people who rose too soon, returned to work too early, or seemed better before pneumonia struck. Recovery required restraint, which was not easy in households that needed wages and labour. A young man who felt his fever drop might insist he could go back to the shop. A mother might order him back to bed with a severity born of terror. Rest became a discipline, and sometimes a luxury. In worse cases, the house darkened in ways no lamp could change. The cough deepened, the breathing grew wet or strained, the face changed colour. The patient became too tired to speak. The caretaker stopped leaving the room except when necessary. Someone was sent for the doctor again. Someone else was sent for a relative, perhaps quietly, so the children would not understand. The house entered that strange suspended state families know when they are waiting not for improvement, but for a verdict. Ordinary sounds become offensive. A spoon dropped in the kitchen feels too loud. A child laughing without understanding feels almost impossible to bear. Time gathers around the bed, but even then, the work continues. That is one of the hardest and most honest things about domestic crisis. Grief may be approaching, but water still has to be heated. Sheets still have to be changed. The patient still needs turning. Someone still needs to answer the door. Someone still has to decide what to tell the children. A family does not get to become entirely emotional. It must remain practical until the last possible moment. In 1918, ordinary Americans performed that practicality again and again, in houses where no historian stood watching, where no photograph was taken, where the only record might be a death certificate, a newspaper notice, or a line in a diary saying that influenza had entered the home. If the patient survived, the closed door eventually opened differently. Not all at once. The room would still smell of illness. The bedding would need washing, perhaps boiling. The dishes would be scalded, the windows would stay open. The patient might be allowed to sit near the window, wrapped in blankets, pale and thin, hair damp, hands weak, looking at the street or yard as if it belonged to a world from which they had been absent longer than the calendar allowed. The rest of the family would orbit carefully. Children would stare. Adults would speak too brightly. Food would be offered in small amounts. The recovered person might ask what happened while they were sick, and the answer could be difficult because the world outside had not paused. Others had fallen ill. Someone had died. The school was still closed. The war news had changed. The neighbour across the street had a sign on the door now. Recovery did not restore the house immediately. It left behind laundry, debt, missed wages, fear of relapse, and a new awareness of how quickly ordinary life could be taken apart. But it also left gratitude so sharp it could feel almost painful. A person standing after influenza, even shakily, was not just a patient improving. They were proof that the house had not lost this one. Families marked that quietly. A better meal if food was available, a prayer, a letter to relatives saying the fever had broken, a window opened wide, a careful return to work. The first time the recovered person laughed, even weakly, everyone noticed and pretended not to. And then, sometimes before the sheets were even fully dry, another cough sounded elsewhere in the house. That was the cruelty of household influenza. It could move like a visitor from bed to bed. The caretaker became the patient. The younger child who had been kept away developed chills. The father returned from work with a headache. The neighbour who had brought soup stopped answering the door. The closed room changed occupants. The family learned the routine again because now they had no choice. They knew where the basin should go, they knew which cup to use, they knew how to tie the mask. They knew the smell of the disinfectant and the long shape of the night. Experience made them more competent, but not less afraid. So when we talk about ordinary Americans surviving the 1918 flu pandemic, we should not imagine survival as a single brave act. It was not one decision, one rule, one heroic moment. It was repetition. It was the same door opened and closed carefully. The same spoon lifted to dry lips. The same sheets changed with tired hands. The The same whispered argument over whether to call the doctor again. The same child told to stay back. The same mother sitting upright in a chair because lying down would mean falling asleep, and falling asleep felt dangerous. Survival happened in these unrecorded motions, in thousands upon thousands of homes where people had no cure to offer and still refused to offer nothing. Outside those homes, the larger machinery of American life was beginning to respond in visible ways. Notices appeared. Schools closed. Churches suspended services. Theatre owners complained. Masks were sewn in bulk. Streetcar rules changed. Public funerals were restricted. Cities and towns tried to manage movement, breath, crowds, and fear with the tools they had, some wise, some clumsy, some too late. But before those rules reached the street, before the public orders became the daily reality of an entire community, the pandemic had already done its most intimate work. It had entered through a cough, crossed a room, closed a door, and taught a family to wait. By the time the rules reached the street, the sickness had already entered the language of ordinary life. People were no longer only asking who was ill. They were asking whether the school would open, whether the streetcar was safe, whether church would meet on Sunday, whether the theatre lights would come back on, whether a wedding should still happen, whether a funeral could be held, whether a cough in public made you careless, whether standing too close to another person had become a kind of danger. These were not questions Americans were used to asking every hour of the day. They were people accustomed to crowded platforms, busy shop counters, church pews filled shoulder to shoulder, children packed into classrooms, men pressed together in factories, women standing in market lines, soldiers boarding trains while bands played and families gathered close to watch them go. American public life in 1918 was physical. It was noisy. It was shared. It depended on bodies being near other bodies. And then, almost overnight in some places, that nearness became suspicious. The first strange thing many people noticed was the mask. Not in the sick room, where a strip of gauze over the face at least made a certain kind of sense, but out in the open, on the street, in offices, on streetcars, behind counters, on the faces of policemen, nurses, clerks, barbers, telephone operators, elevator attendants, and sometimes ordinary pedestrians who had decided they would rather look odd than take the risk. A flu mask in 1918 was usually not the fitted object a modern person imagines. It was often made of layers of gauze or cheesecloth, tied behind the head, folded across the nose and mouth, sometimes neat and white, sometimes wrinkled and damp, sometimes worn properly, sometimes hanging below the nose in the same human way people have always found to obey a rule halfway. Women sewed them at home. Red Cross workers made them by the thousands. Drugstores ran short of gauze. Newspapers printed instructions. Public officials urged them. In some cities, they were required for people working with the public. In a few places, ordinary citizens could be fined for refusing. Try to imagine the first morning you stepped outside and saw your town wearing cloth over its face. The grocer, whose smile you knew. The conductor taking fares. The young woman at the telephone exchange. The policeman on the corner. The boy delivering newspapers. Everyone still present, still doing the tasks of the day, but half hidden. A mask changes a face in a way that is difficult to overstate. It removes the quick little signs by which people reassure one another. The polite smile, the tired smile, the expression that says, "Yes, I know, this is strange, but we are getting through it." In 1918, those signals disappeared under gauze. Voices came out slightly muffled. People repeated themselves. Some laughed because embarrassment needed somewhere to go. Some felt safer. Some felt foolish. Some became angry because the mask felt like a public accusation, as if the city itself were saying, "Your breath may be dangerous, your mouth may betray your neighbours, your ordinary habits can no longer be trusted." And that was really what the new rules were doing. They were taking the invisible seriously. Americans could understand dirt. They could understand spoiled food, bad water, the smell of a sick room. the visible grime of a crowded alley. But influenza moved through air and closeness and breath in a way that made ordinary social life feel suddenly unreliable. Public health notices told people to cover coughs and sneezes, not to spit, not to crowd, not to share drinking cups, not to stand too close in lines, not to visit unnecessarily, not to gather for pleasure, sometimes not even to gather for prayer. A person could look perfectly healthy and still be someone to avoid. That idea was difficult to live with because it pushed suspicion into every familiar encounter. The neighbour at the fence, the friend at the shop, the cousin at the door, the man beside you on the streetcar, the woman kneeling in the pew you usually shared on Sunday. Every one of them was still human, still known, still deserving of kindness, and yet every one of them might carry the thing that could enter your house by evening. The streetcar became one of the clearest symbols of the problem. In 1918, streetcars were the bloodstream of many American cities. They carried clerks to offices, factory workers to shifts, domestic servants to wealthier neighbourhoods, shoppers downtown, school children, soldiers, nurses, messengers, everyone who could not afford a private automobile and did not live within walking distance of work. The streetcar was democratic in the most uncomfortable sense. It forced strangers into the same enclosed space, their shoulders close, hands gripping the same straps, breath mingling in the same air, windows closed against cold or opened against orders, depending on the weather and the stubbornness of the passengers. Once influenza spread, that ordinary ride became a calculation. Picture a worker standing at a streetcar stop before dawn. The air is cold enough that he can see his breath. He has already heard the warnings. Maybe the city has ordered streetcar windows kept open when possible. Maybe signs have appeared telling people not to spit and not to cough openly. Maybe the conductor is wearing a mask. Maybe passengers are supposed to wear them too. But the man still has to get to work. He cannot simply decide that the streetcar is too risky and remain home for 2 weeks. There is rent, there is food, there is coal, there may be a sick child in the house already, which makes the wages more necessary, not less. So he boards. He tries to stand where the air moves. He notices every cough. He tells himself not to touch his face, though that exact phrase may not be the one he uses. He watches a woman pull her scarf closer over her mouth. He watches a young man laugh at the masks. He watches the conductor handle coin after coin. The ride is the same length as it always was, but now it feels like something that must be survived. For women, the rules of movement could be just as hard. A mother still needed food. Someone had to buy bread, milk, potatoes, soap, medicine, cloth, coal oil, whatever the household lacked. If markets were open, they were full of people trying to complete errands quickly without admitting they were afraid. If stores had rules, shoppers had to learn them. Keep moving. Do not linger. Do not crowd the counter. Do not bring children unless necessary. Wear a mask if required. Some shopkeepers placed signs in windows. Some limited entry. Some wiped counters more often than before. Some wore masks reluctantly because health officers demanded it, or because customers expected it. The simplest purchase became slower. A loaf of bread carried home was not only bread, it was evidence that someone had gone out among strangers and returned. Children felt the changes in ways adults sometimes underestimated. The closing of schools sounded at first like freedom, and perhaps for one morning it was. No bell, no lessons, no teacher at the front of the room, but this was not a holiday. Playgrounds might be restricted. Gatherings of children might be discouraged. Parents who had once sent children outside to release their noise now called them back from sidewalks and neighbours' yards. In some cities, children were told not to attend moving picture shows because the shows were closed. They could not go to Sunday school because church gatherings had stopped. They could not visit a friend whose house had a sickness sign on the door. The city had shrunk, and for children that shrinkage could feel like punishment for a crime nobody explained clearly enough. Schools were not only places of learning, They were daily structure. They kept children in a known place while parents worked. They provided supervision. They made the day predictable. When schools closed, the household had to absorb the children back into itself, and not every household was ready. A mother with sick relatives now had more bodies underfoot. A working parent had to decide whether an older child should watch the younger ones. In crowded apartments, children spent long days in rooms where adults were also trying to rest, cook, nurse the sick, or keep up with paid work brought home if they were lucky enough to have such work. In rural areas, school closures could mean children were simply folded back into farm chores. In cities, it could mean idleness, restlessness, and worry. The public order may have said school closed. The private result was 1,000 different household problems. Then there were the churches. To understand what it meant to close churches in 1918, we have to remember that for many Americans, church was not only worship, it was information, community, morality, routine, music, charity, courtship, comfort, and social belonging all under one roof. Sunday gathered people who might spend the rest of the week scattered across farms, boarding houses, factories and kitchens. It gave shape to time. It marked respectability. It gave grieving families a place to be seen. It gave lonely people somewhere to sit among others. It gave poor families access to relief networks. It gave children instruction, women organisational life, men public standing, immigrants a familiar language, and entire communities a shared rhythm. Closing a church was not like cancelling a lecture. It removed one of the main structures through which people understood hardship. So the orders were not always welcomed. Ministers worried about souls. Parishioners worried about neglecting God in a time when death seemed to be passing door to door. Some argued that if stores and war industries could remain open, churches should not be treated as more dangerous than commerce. Others accepted the closures as an act of love, a way of protecting the congregation from itself. Some pastors printed sermons in newspapers or mailed devotional guidance. Some churches held abbreviated services when allowed, with fewer people, more space, open windows or masks. Some rang bells for prayer even when pews remained empty. In Catholic parishes, Protestant churches, synagogues, and other religious communities, the same painful adjustment had to be made in different forms. How do you remain a community when gathering may harm the people you are trying to comfort? The hardest collision came around funerals. The church could close for ordinary Sunday worship and still hope to reopen later. A funeral could not be postponed indefinitely, not in a season when bodies had to be buried quickly and undertakers were overwhelmed. Yet funerals were gatherings, and gatherings were dangerous. Families who had expected a congregation, hymns, prayers, neighbours, relatives, and the solemn dignity of ritual sometimes found themselves limited to a few people, a shortened service, or no proper service at all. This was not only inconvenient, it was emotionally damaging. Grief needs witnesses. In 1918, many people lost not only family members, but the old form of being held by the community after loss. A mother might stand at a graveside with only a handful present, while half the people who would have come were sick, quarantined, afraid, or forbidden by rule. The absence of mourners could feel like a second abandonment, even when everyone understood why. Theatres and moving picture houses were another battlefield of daily life, though a very different one. By 1918, movies had become a major part of American popular culture. For working people especially, the movie theatre offered a few hours of escape, darkness, warmth, laughter, drama, and a seat away from the demands of home. Dance halls, saloons, pool rooms, lodges, clubs, and public entertainments gave adults a way to loosen the tightness of the week. When health departments ordered them closed, they were removing danger, but they were also removing release. It is easy to say people should simply have stayed home. It is harder to remember what home might have been: cramped, cold, worried, full of sick relatives, unpaid bills, restless children, and the constant newspaper count of deaths. The The closed theatre was not only a public health measure, it was another sign that pleasure itself had become suspect. Some business owners resisted because closures threatened their survival. A theatre owner did not stop owing rent because influenza arrived. A saloon keeper still had inventory. A barber still needed customers. A lodge hall still had bills. Workers in those places lost wages too. Public health orders often looked clean in official language and messy in economic reality. Close the dance hall and you reduce crowding. You also remove pay from musicians, cleaners, ticket sellers, managers, and others whose names never appear in the order. Close the school and you reduce children gathering. You also create trouble for parents who must work. Ban public meetings and you reduce spread. You also interrupt politics, mutual aid societies, immigrant associations, union meetings, fraternal groups, and charity work. A pandemic rule could be wise and still costly. That was one reason people argued about them. Mask rules brought their own tensions. Some Americans wore masks as a patriotic duty. This mattered because the country was at war, and officials often framed public health as part of wartime responsibility. To protect yourself was also to protect soldiers, workers, nurses, and the nation. A person who refused might be scolded as selfish or unpatriotic. In some places, people who did not wear masks were called slackers, a word already loaded with wartime shame. A slacker was someone who failed to do his part. That language had force. It turned a piece of gauze into a moral test. Did you care enough about your neighbours to put it on? Did you respect the city? Did you support the war effort? Did you understand that freedom for the moment meant accepting discomfort? But not everyone accepted the argument. Some thought masks were useless. Some thought officials were overreaching. Some wore them only when police were nearby. Some cut holes in them for cigars, which tells you as much about human nature as any public record ever could. In San Francisco, where masks became especially associated with the public response, compliance and resistance both appeared. People wore them in offices, on streets, in streetcars and at work, but resentment grew when rules returned or remained longer than many wanted. That is an important part of the story, because ordinary Americans did not become perfectly obedient just because the danger was real. They grew tired, they doubted, they joked, they cheated, they complained. They did what people do when an emergency lasts longer than the first rush of fear. Fatigue became its own public health problem. At the beginning, fear can make people careful. They read every notice, obey every instruction, watch every symptom. But days become weeks. Wages are lost. Children are bored. Masks itch. Windows left open make streetcars cold. Churches feel empty. Theatres remain dark. People miss one another. They begin to ask whether the danger is really as bad as officials say, especially if nobody in their own household has died. Or if someone has died, they may decide that rules failed anyway. A city can order people apart, but it cannot easily regulate grief, boredom, loneliness, poverty, and denial. Those forces move quietly beneath the surface of compliance. Armistice Day revealed that tension in a powerful way. On November 11th, 1918, the war ended, and Americans poured into streets to celebrate. For weeks they had been told to avoid crowds. For years they had lived with war. The release was enormous. Bells rang. People shouted, sang, embraced, waved flags, filled streets, forgot distance, or chose to forget it because joy can be as contagious as fear. Public health officials worried, and with reason. Crowds were exactly what influenza needed. But to many ordinary people, staying home on the day the war ended felt impossible. This was one of the cruel choices of 1918. The country had been asked to sacrifice for victory, and when victory came, the safest response was restraint. Not everyone could manage that. Maybe very few people could have. For those who did remain cautious, daily life became a practice in small avoidances. Walk instead of taking the streetcar if the distance allowed. Shop early to miss the crowd. Stand near the door. Turn your face away when someone coughs. Do not shake hands. Do not let children visit houses where illness has been reported. Air out rooms. Wash more often. Carry your own cup. Keep your mask in place. Avoid the funeral, then feel guilty. Skip church, then pray at home. Refuse a neighbour's invitation, then wonder if you have offended them. These were not grand acts, but they accumulated. A person's whole day could be filled with little decisions that made them feel both careful and rude. The rule against spitting may sound almost comical now, but it was serious in 1918. Public spitting had long been a target of health campaigns because of tuberculosis and other diseases. Men spat on sidewalks, in streetcars, in workplaces, in saloons, sometimes into cuspidors, sometimes not. Influenza gave new urgency to old campaigns. Signs warned people. Police could enforce ordinances. Streetcar notices scolded passengers. The message was blunt because officials wanted it to be remembered. Careless mouths could spread disease. This was not gentle etiquette. It was public survival stated in the language of discipline. Cover your cough. Do not spit. Use your handkerchief. Do not endanger others. There is something revealing in how much of the pandemic response focused on manners. Do not crowd. Do not cough openly. Do not spit. Do not visit casually. Do not demand a public funeral. Do not insist on amusement. Do not turn your uncovered face toward another person. The rules were medical, but they were also social. They asked people to remake courtesy. Before the pandemic, friendliness might mean coming close, clasping hands, visiting the sick, filling a church, attending a funeral, sitting beside a neighbour. During the pandemic, friendliness could mean staying away. That reversal was difficult. It still is, whenever disease forces distance. Human beings often show love by presence. In 1918, they had to learn that absence could also be care. Not everyone had the same ability to follow the new manners. Wealthier families could withdraw more easily. They might have larger homes, private transport, paid help, space to isolate the sick, savings to survive closures, and access to doctors who answered their calls sooner. Working-class families could not retreat as cleanly. A seamstress, a laundress, a factory hand, a streetcar conductor, a shop clerk, a coal delivery man, a domestic servant, a hotel worker, a telephone operator, a nurse, a janitor. These people could not simply vanish from public life. Their work placed them where disease travelled. The rules told them to avoid danger while the economy told them to stand inside it. This is one of the uncomfortable truths of the pandemic. The public measures protected communities, but the burden of keeping life running fell unevenly on those with the least room to protect themselves. For Black Americans, the pandemic unfolded inside a segregated society that had already limited access to hospitals, nursing care, decent housing, and public resources. In many places, black patients faced separate facilities or exclusion from white institutions. Black nurses and doctors served communities with fewer supplies and less recognition. Public health messages did not erase discrimination. If anything, emergencies often exposed how deeply it shaped survival. In crowded neighbourhoods, among families already facing lower wages and poorer housing, the new rules could be harder to follow and the consequences more severe. Yet black communities also organised care, raised funds, relied on churches, mutual aid groups, women's clubs, and local leaders to support families in need. When public life closed, those networks had to adapt under pressure, just like everyone else's, but with fewer official supports. Immigrant communities faced their own challenges. Notices printed only in English did not reach everyone equally. Rumours travelled faster than translations. Wartime suspicion of foreign-born residents, especially those from countries associated with America's enemies, added another layer of fear. A family might worry not only about the flu, but about officials entering the home, about lost work, about being misunderstood at a clinic, about whether a quarantine sign would bring stigma from neighbours already quick to judge. Churches, synagogues, ethnic newspapers, mutual aid societies, and neighbourhood leaders became crucial bridges, explaining rules, sharing practical advice, and helping families navigate a public health system that did not always speak to them clearly or kindly. In small towns, the rules arrived with a more personal force. In a city, a closure order might feel like something issued by a distant department. In a town, the man announcing it might be someone you knew, someone whose children attended school with yours, someone who bought meat from your brother, someone you would see again after the crisis. Closing the church meant telling specific parishioners not to come. Closing the school meant sending home specific children. Banning public gatherings meant cancelling the lodge meeting, the harvest event, the political rally, the funeral of a person everyone knew. Enforcement was intimate. Resentment was intimate too. If the rules seemed unfair or inconsistent, people remembered exactly who had made them. Still, many communities complied because the evidence was becoming hard to deny. Empty chairs have a way of settling arguments. When a teacher died, when the postman became ill, when the doctor's office was overwhelmed, when 3 houses on one street had sickness at the same time, the rules no longer seemed like something invented by nervous officials. They became the framework by which people tried to continue. The mask might be uncomfortable, but the neighbour without one seemed reckless. The closed church hurt, but the thought of coughing among elders in the pews hurt more. The streetcar windows made the ride cold, but the stale warmth of a sealed car felt worse. The rules became part of common sense, not everywhere and not for everyone, but enough that daily life changed. There were also small acts of adaptation that carried people through. Families held prayer at home, ministers sent printed messages, teachers assigned lessons through newspapers or by packets when possible. Children wrote letters instead of visiting. Women's groups turned sewing circles toward masks and relief supplies. Neighbours spoke from porches, across fences, through windows. Couples postponed weddings or held them quietly. Businesses changed hours. Some workplaces staggered shifts. People learned which stores were less crowded and which streetcar runs were worse. In these practical adjustments, survival became routine. Not easy, not calm, but routine. A pandemic does not become livable because fear disappears. It becomes livable because people build habits around fear. I want you to think for a moment about the sound of a city with its amusements closed. No theatre audience laughing behind the doors, no dance hall music spilling into the street, no schoolyard noise at noon, church bells perhaps, but no congregation moving toward them. Streetcars still grinding along, but with open windows and masked passengers. Shops open in some districts, closed in others. Footsteps quicker than usual, conversations shorter, coughs more noticeable. The city is not silent. It is working too hard to be silent. But the sound has changed. Pleasure has been turned down. Caution has been turned up. Even people who reject the rules cannot escape the atmosphere they create. At home, these public rules reshape the family's evening. The father coming back from work might remove his mask at the door and wash before touching the children. A mother returning from the market might set packages down carefully and complain about the crowd at the grocer. Children might ask when school would reopen and receive the same answer each time. Soon, maybe, when it is safe. A grandmother might insist that church should never have been closed. A teenage son might argue that the mask is nonsense. Someone might mention a neighbour fined for refusing to wear one, and the room would divide into opinions. Pandemic rules entered household conversation the way weather and prices did. They became daily material, argued over at tables, in kitchens, on porches, in letters. The newspaper became a guide and a source of worry. Each day it carried official notices, advice columns, death counts, reopening announcements, warnings against panic, warnings against carelessness, reports from other cities, advertisements for medicines, and sometimes patriotic language linking health obedience to national duty. People read carefully, even when they did not fully trust what they read. The paper told them whether theatres might reopen, whether churches would remain closed, whether schools were still suspended, whether masks were required, whether the health officer believed the peak had passed. A single sentence could change the mood of a household. Cases declining, ban extended, more nurses needed, public funerals prohibited, schools to reopen Monday. The printed page became a kind of weather report for fear. When restrictions lifted, relief came quickly, sometimes too quickly. People wanted their lives back. Children returned to schools, churches opened, theatres advertised shows, masks came off, streetcars filled more comfortably. But influenza had not always finished moving. In some places, easing rules led to renewed spread. Officials faced pressure from every direction. Keep things closed and be accused of damaging livelihoods, worship, morale, and common life. Open too soon and watch cases rise again. Ordinary Americans watched these decisions with a mixture of hope and suspicion. They wanted safety, but they also wanted wages, school, worship, funerals, music, and the ability to stand near another person without thinking about death. That desire was not trivial. It was the desire for society itself, and this is where the public story returns to the private house. Because every mask on a streetcar, every closed church door, every dark theatre, every school notice, every anti-spitting sign, every open window in a cold car, every argument over whether officials had gone too far, all of it was ultimately about the same small scene we began with. Someone in a bed, someone beside that bed. A family hoping the sickness would not spread from one room to the next. The rules of daily life were not abstractions. They were attempts, imperfect and uneven, to keep the first cough from becoming the whole household, the whole street, the whole town. By late evening, when the worker came home from the streetcar, when the mother returned from the market, when the church remained closed and the schoolbook sat unused, the rules settled into the house with everyone else. Masks hung near the door or lay folded on a table. Newspapers rustled, children asked questions, adults answered carefully. Somewhere nearby, a bell rang or a wagon passed or a neighbour knocked and left something on the step before walking away. Public life had been rearranged, but the most important work was still waiting in the rooms where fever had already found a place. The sick needed washing, feeding, turning, watching. The rules could slow the spread, but they could not sit through the night in a chair beside the bed. That part still belonged to the people inside the home, and the sick room was where all the fear of the street finally came to rest. The sick room in 1918 was rarely a room built for sickness. That is one of the first things to understand. It was not a hospital room with clean white walls, a call button, a metal bed that could be raised and lowered, a nurse's station just beyond the door, and shelves stocked with equipment for whatever might happen next. It was a bedroom, or a parlour, or a corner of a kitchen screened off by a sheet. It was a child's bed pushed away from the others. It was a rented room in a boarding house where the wallpaper had already begun to peel from the damp. It was the front room of a farmhouse because that was where the windows opened widest, and the stove was close enough to keep the air from freezing. It was whatever space an ordinary family could surrender to illness when the fever came in and would not leave. And once the sick room was made, the rest of the house began to orbit around it. The first thing people noticed was the bed. It sounds too simple, but the bed became the centre of everything. In a healthy house, a bed is just furniture. You leave it in the morning and return to it at night. You smooth the covers if you have time, or you do not. You toss a coat over it. A child climbs on it with dirty shoes and is scolded. But when influenza entered the house, the bed became a place of watching. The sheets mattered, the pillow mattered, the distance between the bed and the window mattered. The blanket tucked around the body mattered, because the sick person might be burning with fever and shivering as if winter had entered their bones. Families moved with a new caution around that bed, as if the floorboards near it had become part of the disease. If the household had clean sheets, they used them quickly. Fever made people sweat through bedding in a way that frightened caretakers, not because sweat itself was unfamiliar, but because of the speed of it and the weakness that came with it. A patient might soak a nightshirt, then the sheet beneath it, then wait confused, chilled and trembling while the person caring for them tried to change the bedding without making them sit up for too long. This was hard work. A wet sheet under a sick adult is heavy. A patient with influenza could be too weak to help, too dizzy to lift their own shoulders, too breathless to tolerate much movement. The caretaker had to roll them gently to one side, pull the damp sheet away, tuck the clean one under, roll them back, and then smooth everything with hands that were trying to move quickly without seeming alarmed. The laundry did not wait until the emergency ended. It grew every day. Sheets, pillowcases, towels, handkerchiefs, nightclothes, cloths used for wiping sweat or catching coughs. All of it had to be dealt with. In houses with running water and a proper stove, this was exhausting enough. In poorer homes, in tenements, in boarding houses, in farmhouses where water had to be pumped or carried and heated by hand, it became a second illness inside the first. Boiling water took fuel. Fuel cost money. Soap cost money. Time cost sleep. A woman might spend the morning changing bedding, the afternoon washing it, and the night sitting beside the same bed while the next set of sheets grew damp beneath the patient. No one called this medical work in a formal way, but it was one of the main forms medical care took inside ordinary American homes. There was a smell to the room that families remembered even when they did not write it down. Sick rooms have always had their own weather. The air becomes warm from the body in the bed, sharp from disinfectant, sour from sweat, damp from cloths, stale if the windows are kept closed, cold if they are open too long. In 1918, doctors and health boards often encouraged fresh air, and many families took that seriously. Windows were raised even in chilly weather. Curtains moved. A patient might be wrapped in blankets while the room itself was aired out, because fresh air was believed to be part of recovery, and because crowded, closed rooms had become frightening. But the window created arguments too. One person worried the patient would take a chill. Another insisted the air had to move. A grandmother might say the draft would make the lungs worse. A nurse, if one had visited, might say the room must be ventilated. The window became another decision, and during illness even small decisions could feel heavy. Beside the bed stood the objects of care. A chair, first of all, because someone had to sit there. A small table if the family had one to spare. A glass of water, or a cup, or a tin mug. A spoon, a basin, a towel, a bottle from the drugstore. A thermometer if the household owned one or had borrowed one from a neighbour. A lamp. Perhaps a rosary, a Bible, a prayer book, a photograph, a letter from a soldier's son overseas tucked under the corner of the pillow because the patient kept asking for it. The arrangement was practical, but it also had the look of a little altar to survival. Everything the family could offer was gathered close to the bed, as if closeness itself could help. The patient's thirst was one of the constant concerns. Fever dried the mouth and cracked the lips. The sick person might not want to drink, might turn away, might be too tired to swallow more than a little. But caretakers understood that fluids mattered, even if they did not speak in the modern language of dehydration. So the spoon came again and again. A sip of water, a little tea, broth if the stomach could manage it, milk in some houses, though not every patient could tolerate it. Barley water, lemonade if lemons were available, orange juice in households that could afford oranges, beef tea, chicken broth, whatever seemed nourishing and possible. The caretaker would lift the head slightly, hold the cup, wait, wipe the mouth, and try again later. Broth had a special place in that sick room. It was food, but it was also reassurance. A pot of broth on the stove told the household that something useful was happening. Bones, chicken, beef, vegetables, salt, whatever the kitchen could provide went into water and was simmered until the liquid seemed strong enough to offer to someone who could not chew. A patient who took broth and kept it down gave the family something to hold on to. Appetite was watched almost the way breathing was watched. If the sick person asked for food, even a little, even toast softened in milk or a few spoonfuls of soup, hope moved through the house quietly. No one wanted to say too much. Hope in a sick room can be superstitious. Families feared that speaking it aloud might frighten it away, but they noticed. They always noticed. At the same time, families were surrounded by medicines and promises, some useful for comfort, some useless, some potentially harmful. Drugstores sold remedies for coughs, colds, grip, catarrh, nerves, weakness, and almost anything else that could be printed on a label. Patent medicine advertisements had been part of American life for decades, and the pandemic gave desperate people reason to buy bottles they might have ignored in calmer times. Some contained alcohol, opiates, or other ingredients that soothed without curing. Aspirin was widely used, and doctors sometimes recommended it for fever and pain, though dosing practices were not always what they would later become. Families trusted what they had, what the doctor suggested, what the druggist sold, what a neighbour swore had helped in another case. In the absence of a cure, people reached for relief. This is important to understand gently. Ordinary Americans were not foolish because they used home remedies or store-bought mixtures that could not defeat influenza. They were living in a world where medicine had not yet caught up to the emergency. They were doing what human beings have always done when someone they love is suffering, and the official answer is mostly rest, fluids, and time. They tried things. They rubbed the chest. They made steam. They placed mustard plasters. They gave warm drinks. They rubbed the skin with camphor or mentholated ointment if they had it. They used hot water bottles to ease chills. They folded cool cloths for the forehead. They prayed over the bed. Some of it helped with comfort. Some of it did very little. But all of it gave hands a task when helplessness was too much to bear. The caretaker's hands were always moving. That is the detail I want you to hold on to. They adjusted blankets, lifted cups, folded cloths, opened windows, closed windows, tested the forehead, straightened the pillow, wiped the face, carried out dishes, brought in fresh water, changed towels, tied and retied masks, touched the wrist for a pulse, held a lamp closer to look at the patient's colour, and then did it all again. The sick room was not still. The patient might be still, terribly still at moments, but the care around them was constant. And most of that care was done by people who had not slept enough and who were also afraid they might be next. Fear in the sick room did not always look dramatic. It often looked like attention, someone watching too closely, someone pausing at the doorway to listen before entering, someone counting the seconds between breaths without admitting they were counting, someone asking the same question every hour because the answer mattered. How do you feel now? The patient might be too tired to answer honestly. Or might say, better, because they wanted the watcher to rest. Sick people often comfort the healthy in quiet ways. A daughter may tell her mother she's all right because she can see the mother's face. A husband may force a smile because the children are watching from the hallway. A boy may insist he's not afraid because he has heard adults praising bravery in soldiers all year and thinks bravery means hiding fear, even from the person who loves him most. The breathing changed everything. Fever was frightening. Coughing was frightening. Delirium was frightening. But breathing was the line families learned to hear. At first, the patient breathed like someone with a hard cold, uncomfortable but familiar. Then, in dangerous cases, the breathing became quicker, shallower, harder. The cough might deepen, the chest might ache, the patient might struggle to get enough air, lips might darken, fingertips might look wrong. The face might take on a bluish or dusky colour that made people speak softly because it seemed almost indecent to say what they feared. Families sent for the doctor when breathing changed. They sent for him again if he did not come. They sent a boy running, or telephoned if they had a telephone, or asked a neighbour with an automobile to go. But doctors in many communities were overwhelmed. The call could take hours. Sometimes no one came in time, so the family did what they could. They propped the patient up with pillows because lying flat made breathing worse. They loosened collars and nightclothes. They kept the room aired. They tried to calm the patient because panic made breath harder. They sat close enough to be useful and far enough in theory to be safe, though the distance often vanished when suffering became severe. A mother does not remain 6 feet from a child who is gasping. A wife does not measure public health guidance against the instinct to hold her husband upright. In those moments, the rules of disease met the older rules of love, and love often reached forward. Delirium brought another kind of fear. High fever could make patients confused, restless, or unreachable. They might speak nonsense, ask for people who were not there, try to get out of bed, return in their minds to work, school, the battlefield, the kitchen, the train station, someplace the fever had built from memory. A soldier in a camp hospital might think he was still drilling. A factory worker might insist she was late. A child might cry for a toy that had been moved. A mother sick in bed might keep asking whether supper had been made, because even fever could not erase the habits of responsibility. Families found these moments deeply unsettling because the person was present and not present at the same time. Their body lay in the room, but their mind had gone somewhere the family could not follow. Night made all of this worse. During the day, the sick room had errands and light. The caretaker could tell herself there were tasks to do. A neighbour might knock. A doctor might come. The street outside might offer ordinary sounds. At night, the house narrowed. The lamp made a small circle. The rest of the room fell into shadow. Every sound from the bed became larger. A cough could wake the household. A long pause between breaths could make the person in the chair sit straight up, heart pounding. If other family members were sleeping, the caretaker had to decide whether to wake them. If the patient worsened, someone might have to run for help in the dark through streets or roads where other houses also held fever. This was when exhaustion became dangerous. The person watching the sick might begin the night determined to stay awake and then drift without meaning to. Her head would lower. The lamp would blur. The sick person would turn or cough, and she would snap awake with guilt. She might have a mask tied over her face, damp and uncomfortable. Her own throat might feel dry, and she would wonder whether it was fear or the first sign of illness. She might press her hand to her forehead quietly, not wanting anyone to see. Caretakers had to monitor themselves while monitoring others, but they rarely had the luxury of stepping away. If the mother became sick, who would take her place? If the older daughter fell, who would manage the younger children? The sick room always contained the possibility of multiplication. In houses where more than one person fell ill, the work became almost impossible. Beds filled. Couches became beds. Quilts were spread on floors. The well members of the family counted themselves like supplies. Who can stand? Who can carry water? Who can cook? Who can go for the doctor? Who can sit up tonight? Sometimes the answer was nobody strong enough, and that was when neighbours, relatives, volunteers or public relief had to enter the story. But before help arrived, there might be hours when a sick household existed in a kind of frightening suspension. A little child might bring water to an older brother because the adults were in bed. A grandmother might try to care for everyone and become confused from her own fever. A father might crawl from one room to another because standing made him dizzy. These were not scenes people wanted remembered, but they happened. The sick room also had rules for the people not allowed inside. This was especially difficult for children. A child told to stay away from a sick parent could feel abandoned even while the parent was only a few feet away. They might sit in the hallway, knees pulled up, listening. They might ask questions each time the door opened. Is she better? Can I see her? Does she know I am here? Adults often answered quickly because they had too much to do, but the child's fear did not disappear. Sometimes a caretaker would allow a child to stand at the doorway for a moment, not close enough to touch, just close enough to be seen. A sick mother might lift her hand. A child might wave back, suddenly shy, because sickness had made the familiar face strange. Then the door would close again, and the child would be left with that image. Letters entered sick rooms too. In 1918, families were often separated by war, work, migration, and distance. A son in the army might be in a training camp where influenza was spreading violently. A husband might be overseas. A daughter might be working in another city. News moved by letter and telegram, but the pandemic made even communication uncertain. Mail carriers became part of the emergency, carrying words between houses that could not visit one another. A letter read aloud beside the bed could become medicine of a kind. A patient might ask to hear it again. A mother might keep a soldier son's last letter tucked beside her while she fought fever. A family might delay sending word that someone was ill because they did not want to worry a man already near the front. Or they might send word quickly, fearing there would not be time later. The sick room was never entirely cut off from the wider world. War, work, family, money, and news all entered through the mail, through the doctor, through the newspaper, through the worried person standing in the doorway. There is another detail that deserves attention because it shows how quickly ordinary domestic objects became medical tools. Sheets were not only bedding, they became screens. A sheet hung from a line could divide one part of a room from another, giving the illusion of separation when there was no spare bedroom. Towels became masks, compresses, hand covers, cleaning cloths. Bowls became basins. Kitchen spoons became feeding instruments. A chair became a night watch station. Newspapers became sources of instructions and sometimes bedding under dirty work. The whole house was repurposed. The household did not own a hospital, so it turned itself into the closest thing available. For women who were already expected to keep the house clean, the pandemic intensified a duty that had moral force. Cleanliness was not just neatness now, it was protection. Floors were scrubbed, dishes were scalded, laundry was boiled, windowsills were wiped, door handles were noticed in a new way, handkerchiefs were treated with suspicion. People were warned against using common towels or common cups. In some homes, each person was assigned a cup or cloth if the family had enough. In poorer households, there might not be enough of anything, and the same advice that sounded simple in a public notice became nearly impossible in practice. Do not share towels. But what if there are only two? Keep the sick separate. But what if 6 people sleep in 3 rooms? Use clean bedding. But what if the wash cannot dry fast enough? Public health guidance met household scarcity, and the household had to improvise. Hope came in very small measures. A fever dropping by 1 degree, a patient sleeping for 3 hours without coughing. The first request for toast. A clearer voice. Sweat that seemed to break the fever rather than deepen it. A morning when the caretaker entered the room and found the patient looking back with recognition instead of confusion. These moments could fill the whole house with relief, and still nobody would fully relax. Families had learned that influenza could deceive. A person might improve and then worsen. Pneumonia might follow. Weakness could last long after the fever. The instruction to remain in bed was not always followed because life pressed hard. Men returned to work too soon because wages were needed. Women rose too soon because children needed care. Young people, embarrassed by illness and eager to prove strength, tried to resume their lives before their bodies had recovered. Recovery in 1918 required patience from people whose lives often punished patience. Still, when recovery truly began, the sick room changed. The air felt different. Not clean yet, not normal yet, but less watchful. The lamp was no longer kept burning so anxiously. The chair beside the bed might sit empty for a few minutes at a time. The patient could be left alone while the caretaker cooked or washed. The window could be opened for pleasure as well as necessity. The person in the bed might notice the room again. The pattern on the wall, the dust on the table, the way sunlight fell across the floor. After days of fever, ordinary surroundings could look newly important. A recovered patient might ask what day it was, and be startled by the answer. Illness had stolen time. The first time a patient sat up was an event, even if no one called it that. Pillows were arranged. A blanket was placed around the shoulders. Someone warned them not to move too quickly. The face might be pale, the hands thin, the hair flattened from bed, the body weakened in a way that felt humiliating. A person who had been strong only a week earlier might now need help holding a cup. That weakness could frighten them almost as much as the fever had frightened others. The family, relieved, sometimes expected gratitude and patience, but the recovering person might feel restless, ashamed, irritable, or sad. Survival did not always produce immediate joy. Sometimes it produced silence. There were homes where the sick room did not become a recovery room. We need to say that plainly because ordinary Americans lived with that possibility every time they entered. If the breathing worsened beyond help, if the doctor could do nothing, if pneumonia took hold, the sick room became a death room. The family's work changed but did not stop. Someone had to be present. Someone had to send word. Someone had to keep children away or bring them in depending on what the family believed was right. Someone had to prepare for the undertaker, though during the worst weeks the undertaker might be delayed. In many places funerals were restricted, and the old rituals of mourning were shortened or broken. The same bed where hope had been measured in sips of broth could become the place where a family learned that no more care could change the outcome, that knowledge hung over even the homes where patients survived. People knew what could have happened because it was happening nearby. Recovery in one house did not cancel grief in another. A woman washing the sheets after her son's fever broke might look across the street and see crepe on a neighbour's door. A father returning from the drugstore with oranges for his recovering wife might pass a funeral wagon. A child allowed back into the sick room to kiss a mother's hand might later hear that a classmate's mother had died. Hope and fear did not take turns politely in 1918. They existed at the same time, often in the same room. The people who cared for the sick carried memories in their bodies. They remembered the weight of wet bedding, the heat of the forehead, the smell of broth going cold because the patient could not swallow it, the chair that left their back aching after 3 nights, the way a mask felt when it was worn too long, the first time the patient's breathing sounded easier, the moment they realised it did not. These memories were not always written in diaries or reported in newspapers. They stayed in families. They shaped the way people spoke about that autumn for years, or the way they refused to speak about it at all. And the sick room, once emptied, did not immediately return to being just a room. The bedding had to be washed, the mattress aired if possible. The floor scrubbed, the dishes scalded, the windows opened wide, the patient's clothes cleaned or set aside. Families might fumigate or disinfect according to local instructions or personal belief. They might burn cloths used during the illness. They might scrub until their hands cracked. Some of this was practical, some of it was ritual. Cleaning after illness has always been partly about removing germs and partly about convincing the mind that danger has been pushed back. The room had held fear. Now the family wanted it to hold ordinary life again. But ordinary life did not always return at once. The recovered person might remain weak for weeks. A mother who had cared for everyone else might now find herself unable to climb stairs without stopping. A worker might lose wages during recovery and return to a job changed by absence. A child might develop a lingering cough that made everyone nervous. The family's finances might be damaged by doctor bills, medicine, missed work, extra food, or burial costs if there had been a death. The sick room was not only a medical place, it was an economic place. Every day someone remained in bed, the household counted the cost in money as well as fear. And yet there were mornings when the room that had held the sick began to sound normal again. A cup placed down without trembling. A patient complaining about the taste of broth. A child laughing too loudly in the hall and not being hushed so quickly. Someone saying the room needs a proper sweeping. Someone opening the curtains all the way. A neighbour calling from the porch and asking, "How is she today?" And for once the answer being, "Better." That word could travel down a street like good weather. Better. Not well, not safe forever, not untouched, but better. Inside the sick room, ordinary Americans learned the limits of medicine and the power of care. They learned that survival could depend on things so humble they barely seemed worth naming. Clean cloth, boiled water, steady hands, a spoon held patiently, a window opened at the right time, a chair that allowed someone to keep watch, a neighbour who brought soup, a doctor who came even when he was exhausted, a nurse who showed the family what to do before rushing to the next house. They learned that fear could live beside tenderness without cancelling it. They learned that hope was not always a grand feeling. Sometimes it was only the decision to warm the broth again because the patient might want it this time. Outside, the rules of public life were still changing. Masks were being argued over. Streetcars were still carrying people who had no choice but to ride. Churches were still deciding how to pray without gathering. Schools were still closed in some places and reopening in others. But inside the sick room, the country's emergency had become intimate and practical. Someone needed another sip. Someone needed the sheet changed. Someone was breathing a little easier, or a little worse. And beyond the door, people were beginning to understand that no family could endure this entirely alone. Because once the beds filled and the caretakers weakened, survival depended on the hands that came from outside the house. The first person who came to help was not always a doctor. That is one of the most important things to understand about survival in 1918. When we imagine sickness in history, we often picture the doctor arriving with his black bag, stepping through the front door as the family gathers around him, waiting for knowledge to enter the room in human form. And doctors did matter. They mattered deeply. But during the worst weeks of the influenza pandemic, there were too many houses, too many beds, too many fevered people, too many calls coming at once, and not enough doctors to answer them. The first person at the door might be a nurse if the family was fortunate. It might be a Red Cross volunteer wearing a mask and carrying supplies. It might be a neighbour with a basket of soup. It might be a school teacher sent to check on absent children. It might be a woman from the church, or a member of a settlement house, or a motorcar driver bringing someone else who knew what to do. It might be an older girl from down the street, brave because there was no one else available. It might be a man delivering coal because the family inside was too sick to keep the house warm. Help in 1918 often arrived in ordinary clothing. That makes the story harder to see at first, because history tends to remember the dramatic figures, the public officials, the famous physicians, the citywide orders, the headlines, the mortality numbers. But the daily survival of ordinary Americans depended on a much quieter network of people who stepped into homes where influenza had already entered and where fear was waiting behind the door. They came because someone had asked. They came because no one had asked, and that was even more worrying. They came because a light had not appeared in the window, because the children had not been seen, because the milk bottles were still on the porch, because the father had failed to report to work, because the mother who always answered the back door did not come when called. In a pandemic, absence became a message. A house could ask for help simply by going silent. Imagine a street in an American city in October of 1918. The houses are close together. Some are row houses, some are apartments above shops, some are boarding houses where men sleep in rented rooms and share hallways with strangers. Masks are appearing on faces now. The schools may be closed. Church bells may still ring, but the pews are empty. The streetcar still passes, though people look at it with suspicion. Somewhere on that street, one family has been sick for 3 days. At first, the neighbours knew enough not to intrude. That was part of the new caution. Do not visit the sick unless necessary. Do not expose yourself foolishly. Do not carry sickness back to your own household. But by the 3rd day, caution begins to wrestle with conscience. The shade has not been raised. The youngest child has not come outside. No one has collected the food left on the steps since morning. Someone across the street notices. Someone else says the family may be sleeping. Another says sleeping people still bring in milk before it spoils. Finally, a woman ties a cloth over her face, picks up the basket and crosses the street. That walk from one porch to another was small in distance and enormous in meaning. When she knocks, perhaps nobody answers. She knocks again. She calls through the door. She listens. If she hears movement, she may step back, not wanting to be too close when the door opens. If no one answers, she may go round back, or fetch a neighbour, or call the health department if there is a telephone nearby, or send a child running for help. This is how many households were discovered to be in trouble, not by a formal system working perfectly, but by the old habit of neighbours noticing one another. A family could fall through the cracks if no one noticed. A boarder in a rented room could be missed more easily than a family on a familiar street. A poor immigrant household could suffer longer if language or fear kept them from calling officials. An elderly person living alone might not be found until the situation had become severe. The pandemic turned attention into a form of rescue. Nurses were the people most desperately needed and most painfully scarce. America entered the pandemic with a nursing shortage already made worse by the war. Thousands of trained nurses had been drawn into military service. Camps, ships, and hospitals needed them. The Army and Navy needed them. The Red Cross needed them. Then influenza spread through civilian communities at the same time, and the demand became impossible. Cities begged for nurses. Newspapers printed urgent appeals. Public health departments asked any woman with training, any retired nurse, any practical nurse, any woman who had cared for the sick before to step forward. In some places, crash courses were organised to teach basic home nursing skills to volunteers because there was simply no other choice. People who had never expected to become part of medical relief found themselves learning how to take temperatures, change sheets, prepare food for the sick, disinfect dishes, and recognise signs that a case was becoming dangerous. A trained nurse entering a home in 1918 carried more than supplies. She carried order. That may sound modest, but in a frightened house, order could feel almost like medicine. She knew where the bed should be placed. She knew the patient needed water. She knew how to change a sheet without exhausting the person lying on it. She knew how to keep the room aired without chilling the patient too severely. She knew which cloths must be kept separate, which dishes must not be shared, which signs meant the doctor should be called again. She knew how to speak in a calm voice even when the situation was serious. Families watched her hands. They watched the way she moved. She made the sick room feel less like a room where the family was guessing and more like a place where something could still be done correctly. But nurses were human beings, not symbols, and by the autumn of 1918 many were working beyond any reasonable limit. Some moved from house to house all day and into the night. They visited 10, 15, 20 households, depending on the city and the severity of the outbreak. They entered rooms where several people were ill at once. They found mothers too weak to lift babies, fathers delirious, children hungry, elderly grandparents lying unattended because the younger adults had collapsed. They carried bags that were never full enough. They gave instructions and then had to leave before the family felt ready. They returned when they could. They missed houses that needed them because there were too many. They became ill themselves. Some died. There is a kind of courage that looks less like a single brave decision and more like returning to danger repeatedly after you already understand what it can do. That was the courage of many nurses in 1918. The first house might require nerve. The 10th house required endurance. The 50th house required something deeper than either. They knew they were exposed. They knew masks were imperfect. They knew exhaustion made them vulnerable. Still they went, because a sick child cannot wait for the world to become safe before needing water. The American Red Cross became one of the major forces organising civilian relief. It was already active because of the war, and its volunteers had spent months rolling bandages, making surgical dressings, knitting socks, preparing supplies, raising money, and supporting soldiers. When influenza overwhelmed communities, that wartime organisation could be turned toward the emergency at home. Red Cross chapters recruited nurses, organised volunteers, made masks, gathered food, delivered supplies, helped set up emergency hospitals, and assisted families unable to care for themselves. Women who had been told that supporting the war meant sewing, conserving, donating, and volunteering now found the war and the pandemic meeting at their own doorsteps. The patriotic work of the Homefront became literal Homefront nursing. Red Cross rooms that had once smelled of fabric, paper, wool, and hot coffee now turned into centres of urgency. Women cut gauze, they folded masks, they packed bundles. Lists were made of households needing help, cars were requested, nurses were assigned if any could be found. Volunteers were told where to deliver broth, milk, eggs, clean linens or coal. In some communities, emergency diet kitchens prepared food for the sick because entire families were too weak to cook. Soup was not a small matter then. A pot of soup delivered at the right time could keep children fed while their mother lay in bed. Milk could matter, eggs could matter. Oranges, if available, could feel like a treasure. A basket on a porch might be the difference between a household enduring one more day and falling into complete helplessness. The people who drove help from place to place were part of the survival story too. The motorcar was still not universal in 1918, but where automobiles were available, they became tools of relief. Women's motor corps volunteers drove nurses to houses, carried supplies, transported messages, and helped stretch the reach of overworked medical workers. A nurse who would have lost precious time walking or waiting for public transportation could see more patients if someone drove her. That meant one driver, sitting behind the wheel with a mask on her face and a list of addresses in her hand, could indirectly help many families she never properly met. She might stop in front of one house, wait while the nurse went in, then drive to the next, and the next, and the next, through streets where curtains were drawn and signs marked infected homes. The engine running at the curb became part of the soundscape of emergency. In rural areas, the same need for movement existed, but the distances were longer and the roads often worse. A nurse or doctor might have to travel miles between farms. A neighbour with a horse and wagon or an automobile became essential. Bad weather could delay help. Mud could make roads difficult. A family might send a boy to the nearest telephone or to a neighbour known to have one. In some farming communities, women who had experience with childbirth, fever or household medicine moved from farm to farm as informal nurses. They may not have had certificates, but they had practical knowledge and a willingness to enter houses others feared. In places where professional care could not arrive quickly, that kind of local competence mattered enormously. Neighbours helped in practical ways that rarely made newspapers unless something especially dramatic happened. They fed animals for sick families, they milked cows, they chopped wood, they brought in coal, they watched children, they cooked extra food, they washed laundry, they carried messages. They sat with the sick so a mother could sleep for 2 hours. They took the healthy children into their own homes when it seemed safer, though that decision carried risks no one could calculate perfectly. They dug graves in communities where gravediggers had fallen ill. They made coffins when undertakers were overwhelmed. They did what needed doing, often without language grand enough to describe it. But fear complicated every act of help. We should not smooth that away. A neighbour who brought soup might refuse to enter the house. A relative might hesitate before taking in children from an infected household. A church member might promise to help and then fail to appear because someone in her own family began coughing. Some people shut their doors. Some avoided houses marked with sickness notices. Some crossed the street when they saw a family member from an infected home coming toward them. Some judged others for not helping enough while quietly protecting themselves just as fiercely. The pandemic did not turn communities into perfect circles of kindness. It revealed the strain between duty and self-preservation. People wanted to be good. They also wanted to live. That tension could produce shame. A woman might stand at her own window and watch a neighbour's child carrying water alone, knowing the family needed help, knowing her own husband had warned her not to go near the house. She might tell herself she would go later. She might send food instead. She might feel guilty for years. Another person might enter without hesitation and then bring illness home. Was that courage or recklessness or both? The answers were not simple. Ordinary Americans had to make moral choices under conditions where no choice was clean. Help could save a life. Help could spread the disease. Staying away could protect your family. Staying away could abandon someone else's. This is why organised relief mattered. It gave courage a structure, a Red Cross assignment, a church committee, a visiting nurse association, a women's club, a settlement house, a local health department. These groups helped turn individual fear into coordinated action. A volunteer did not have to decide alone whether a family deserved help or how to provide it. She had a list. She had instructions. She had supplies. She had the sense, however fragile, that she was part of a public effort rather than a solitary person stepping into danger. Organisation did not remove risk, but it reduced chaos, and chaos was one of the pandemic's most dangerous companions. Settlement houses in cities played an important role in many immigrant and working-class neighbourhoods. These institutions already knew the households around them. They knew which families spoke little English, which children were underfed, which mothers needed work, which fathers were unemployed or away, which buildings were overcrowded, which streets had the worst housing. When influenza came, that knowledge became life-saving. A public health notice printed in English might not reach an Italian, Polish, Yiddish-speaking, Slovak, Greek or Mexican household clearly enough. A settlement worker, local priest, rabbi, teacher or neighbour could translate not only the words but the meaning. Stay home if you're sick, do not gather, call for help, keep the room aired, do not share cups, send word if no one can cook. Information had to travel through trust, not only through paper. Churches, even when closed for worship, often remained important centres of relief. A congregation did not stop being a congregation because people could not fill the pews. Ministers, priests, rabbis, deacons, women's aid societies and parish volunteers tried to learn who was sick, who was hungry, who had lost wages, who needed burial assistance, who had children with no one to watch them. In some communities, churchwomen cooked and delivered food. In others, ministers visited cautiously or stood at the doorway to pray. Religious communities had to adapt their deepest instincts. They were built to gather, but now they had to serve without gathering. A basket left on a porch could become a sermon in practical form. Teachers also became part of the network. When schools closed, teachers did not always simply go home and wait. Some helped identify families in trouble. They knew which children were absent before closures, which families were poor, which students had younger siblings, which homes were crowded. In certain places, teachers assisted with relief work, delivered assignments, checked on children, helped with records, or volunteered in emergency efforts. A school teacher in 1918 was often one of the few educated public figures who knew families personally across class lines. That knowledge mattered when a city or town needed to find the houses where no one was strong enough to ask for help. The telephone, where available, became both a tool and a frustration. Families with telephones could call doctors, pharmacies, relatives, or relief offices. But telephone systems depended on operators, and operators became sick too. Many operators were young women working in close conditions, speaking call after call into the machinery of the city's communication. During the pandemic, they handled desperate requests. Doctor, nurse, undertaker, hospital, drugstore, police, family members. If too many operators were absent, communication slowed. A house with a sick child might wait for a connection. Relief workers might struggle to coordinate. The invisible labour of these women became part of the emergency. Their voices, calm or strained, linked households to the help they needed. Food delivery became another form of care. A sick household needed nourishment, but cooking was difficult when everyone was weak. In cities, relief committees arranged delivery of soups, broths, milk, bread, and other simple foods. In small towns, neighbours did it informally. A woman making soup for her own family might double the pot and send half next door. Farmers might bring milk to families unable to collect it. Grocers might extend credit, though not all could afford to. But food also created fear. Who had touched the basket? Should the dishes be returned? Should they be boiled? Should the person delivering stand on the porch or enter the kitchen? The simplest act of feeding another family now required thought. Children in homes needing help were often the most urgent concern. If both parents were sick, children could become hungry, frightened and neglected through no one's fault. Relief workers entering such homes sometimes found children trying to care for adults, or older siblings feeding younger ones with whatever they could find. A 10-year-old might become the person who answers the door and explains that mother has not risen since yesterday. A girl barely in her teens might be changing cloths for a younger brother, while her father lies feverish in another room. Childhood did not protect anyone from responsibility in 1918. It only made the burden more painful to witness. When outside help entered a house like that, it brought more than supplies. It brought adult competence back into the room. Someone made a fire. Someone opened the window. Someone washed dishes. Someone separated the sick children from those still well if there was space. Someone sent for a nurse. Someone prepared food. Someone told the children what to do next. For a child who had spent hours inside a house where the adults had become helpless, the arrival of a capable neighbour or volunteer could feel like the world returning to its proper shape. That feeling mattered. Fear is not only fear of death. Sometimes it is the fear that no one is in charge anymore. Emergency hospitals were created in some communities because homes and regular hospitals could not manage the number of cases. Schools, armories, parish halls, gymnasiums, and other public buildings could be converted into temporary wards. Rows of beds appeared where children had studied, or soldiers had drilled, or townspeople had gathered for meetings. These spaces were often staffed by a mixture of trained nurses, doctors, volunteers, and whoever could be taught quickly enough to be useful. For some patients, being moved to an emergency hospital meant better care than an overwhelmed household could provide. For others, the idea of leaving home was frightening. Families worried they might not see the patient again. During a pandemic, even help could feel like separation. Inside these emergency spaces, the shortage of nurses was visible everywhere. Volunteers cleaned, fed patients, changed linens, carried water, washed dishes, and did basic tasks so trained nurses could focus on the work requiring skill. The division of labour was essential. A trained nurse's time was too valuable to spend fetching every blanket if a volunteer could do it. A volunteer who could not diagnose pneumonia could still keep a patient warm, bring broth, wash a floor, or sit near someone too weak to call out. Survival depended on this layering of labour. Professional skill at the centre, practical help around it, community support around that. No single group could meet the need alone. Black nurses and doctors served with courage in a country that often denied them equal recognition. Some black nurses had struggled to gain acceptance into mainstream nursing organisations and military service despite their training. During the influenza crisis, black medical professionals cared for patients in segregated hospitals, black communities, and sometimes in emergency settings where need forced open doors that prejudice had kept closed. Black churches, women's clubs, mutual aid societies, and community leaders organised relief under the burden of discrimination and fewer resources. Their work was not separate from the national story. It was one of the clearest examples of Americans surviving, not because institutions were fair, but because communities built support where fairness failed. Women's clubs were especially important across many communities. By 1918, women had spent years organising for reform, education, temperance, suffrage, public health, and charity. They knew how to hold meetings, raise funds, manage lists, recruit volunteers, and turn private concern into public work. When influenza came, those skills translated quickly. Club women sewed masks, organised food relief, assisted nurses, checked on families, and supported hospitals. Much of this work looked like an extension of traditional women's labour: feeding, sewing, nursing, cleaning. But in the pandemic, it became civic infrastructure. The same society that often dismissed domestic work as natural female duty suddenly depended on it for public survival. There is an irony there worth sitting with. The pandemic forced into public view the value of work that was usually taken for granted. Washing sheets mattered. Cooking broth mattered. Sitting up at night mattered. Knowing how to care for a feverish body mattered. Women had been doing these things in homes for generations without applause. In 1918, when the scale of sickness overwhelmed formal medicine, those same skills became emergency skills. A woman who knew how to keep a household alive under ordinary conditions was better prepared than many recognised to help keep a community alive under extraordinary ones. But this labour came at a cost. Volunteers became exhausted. Nurses collapsed. Neighbours who helped in one house might return to find sickness in their own. A woman could spend the day delivering food and the night caring for her husband. A nurse could work in an emergency ward and then go home to children she was afraid to touch. A Red Cross worker could make masks for strangers while worrying about a son in an army camp. The people helping were not outside the crisis. They were inside it, trying to hold up one part of the structure while another part pressed down on them. That is why accounts from the period often carry a tone of strain that is difficult to capture. People did not simply rise to the occasion. They were worn down by it. The homes that needed help were not always grateful in the neat way we might expect. Sick people can be irritable. Families under stress can be suspicious. Some resented officials entering the home. Some feared quarantine more than illness because quarantine meant lost wages or public stigma. Some did not want charity because accepting help felt humiliating. Some argued with nurses. Some ignored instructions. Some hid sickness because they feared being marked. A volunteer bringing food might be met with tears in one house and anger in another. Relief work required patience not only with disease but with pride, fear, grief, and exhaustion. And sometimes help came too late. That is part of the truth as well. A neighbour might finally enter and find that the sick person had died during the night. A nurse might arrive after being delayed by too many calls and realise the case had passed beyond what she could do. A relief worker might bring food to children who had already gone hungry for days. These failures were not always the result of indifference. They were the mathematics of an emergency too large for the available hands. But to the family inside the house, the reason may not have mattered. Late help still felt late. When help came in time, though, it could change everything. A nurse showing a mother how to manage the sick room could save strength and prevent mistakes. A neighbour feeding livestock could keep a farm from losing more than health. A volunteer delivering food could allow a caretaker to remain at the bedside. A driver carrying a doctor through the night could bring professional care before pneumonia deepened. A church committee paying for coal could keep a recovering patient warm. A teacher checking on a missing child could uncover a household in crisis. A simple act done at the right moment could hold a family above the line between endurance and collapse. The help was often remembered in specific details. Not the Red Cross helped us, but Mrs. Allen brought soup every afternoon. Not a nurse came, but the nurse with the grey eyes showed us how to turn him. Not the church assisted, but the pastor stood outside the window and prayed because he would not come in and endanger the others. Not neighbours were kind, but the man next door milked the cow for a week. Memory attaches to the concrete because that is how people survive disaster. They remember the hand on the basket, the knock at the door, the car waiting in the street. the clean sheets arriving when there were no clean sheets left. This kind of care also created bonds that lasted after the fever passed. A family might never again see a neighbour as merely someone across the fence after she had entered during influenza. A church committee might learn which households had been quietly poor all along. A town might realise that the widower at the edge of the road had no relatives nearby. A teacher might understand a child's home life differently after carrying food to the door. Emergencies expose needs that ordinary life hides. Once exposed, they cannot always be forgotten, though many communities tried to return to normal quickly, because remembering too much was painful. For the helpers themselves, the pandemic could leave a complicated legacy. Some felt pride, some felt grief, some felt guilt over the houses they could not reach. Some carried illness afterward, or weakness, or memories of rooms no one else wanted described. Nurses especially bore the burden of witness. They saw not one family suffering, but many. They saw patterns others did not. The same blue lips, the same desperate breathing, the same mother asking whether her child would live, the same shortage of sheets, the same lack of beds, the same frightened children, the same exhausted men trying not to cry in front of strangers. To move from house to house was to carry pieces of each house into the next. No training fully protects a person from that, and still, the work continued because need does not wait for emotional readiness. The next address was on the list. The next patient needed broth. The next family needed instruction. The next house had gone quiet. The next ward needed linens. The next child needed someone to notice him. This repetition is one of the reasons the pandemic became both a public disaster and an intimate one. It was not one great scene of emergency. It was thousands of repeated tasks performed by tired people who often had no time to think about history while they were making it. By the time communities had organised relief, the pandemic had already taught Americans something they may not have wanted to learn. The home was essential, but it was not enough. Family love was powerful, but it could be overwhelmed. A mother could sit beside a bed all night, but she could not also drive the doctor, deliver coal, cook for every child, wash every sheet, and stay healthy by force of will. A father could work hard, but he could not earn wages if fever put him flat. Children could help, but they could not replace a nurse. A household could close its door against danger, but if everyone inside became sick, someone outside had to open it again. That was the fragile strength of ordinary America in 1918. Not independence, exactly, though Americans like to speak of independence. Interdependence. A word less romantic, but more accurate. The sick needed the well needed the cautious needed the brave needed organisation, nurses needed drivers. Drivers needed roads, volunteers needed lists, families needed neighbours, cities needed women whose labour had long been undervalued. Rural households needed people willing to cross distance. Immigrant families needed translators and trusted local figures. Black communities needed their own institutions to fill gaps left by discrimination. Everyone needed someone. As autumn deepened, this network of help strained under the weight of sickness, but it did not vanish. It carried food up staircases. It carried nurses through streets. It carried children out of houses where parents could not rise. It carried messages to relatives. It carried masks by the bundle. It carried bodies too when hope had failed, and that was part of the burden no one wanted but someone had to bear. The same community that delivered broth one day might arrange a burial the next. The same volunteer who brought clean linens to a recovering patient might pass a house where the curtains had been drawn for mourning. Help did not always mean saving a life. Sometimes it meant making sure the living were not left entirely alone with what had happened. In the homes that survived, people remembered the helpers. They remembered the nurse who came when no doctor could, the neighbour who ignored fear long enough to knock, the volunteer who left milk on the porch every morning, the church women who cooked, the teacher who checked on the children. the driver who brought medicine through the rain. These people did not end the pandemic. They did not possess a cure. They could not stop the virus from moving across the country. But they made survival possible in the space where national plans met human bodies, in the room where the sheet was wet, the broth was cooling, the children were hungry, and someone had to decide what to do next. Beyond those rooms, the cost was becoming visible in ways no one could ignore. Workplaces were short of hands, shops opened late, or not at all. Streetcars ran with missing crews, schools waited for enough teachers and children to return, churches counted the dead, funeral homes struggled, families that had survived illness now faced bills, lost wages, empty chairs, and the strange quiet that comes after weeks of emergency. The helpers had kept many households from collapsing, but the community around them had been changed, and as the fever moved through towns and cities, ordinary Americans began to see that surviving the sickness was only one part of the ordeal. The next part was learning how to live in a place where work had stopped, funerals had multiplied, and the streets themselves seemed to remember who was missing. There is a particular kind of quiet that settles over a city when work stops before the day is finished. It is not the quiet of night, and it is not the quiet of Sunday morning. It is stranger than that, because everything is still in the place where movement is supposed to be. The factory whistle has blown, but fewer men have answered it. The streetcar track is there, shining in the road, but the cars are running late or not at all. The schoolhouse stands with its windows closed and the playground empty. The theatre poster still promises a show that no one is allowed to attend. The shopkeeper has swept the floor, opened the door, waited an hour, and then closed again because too many customers are sick, too many clerks are missing, and the street outside feels wrong in a way he cannot fix by selling anything. By October of 1918, this wrongness had become part of daily life in many American towns and cities. It did not arrive evenly. One city might be in full emergency while another tried to convince itself the worst was still far away. One town might close schools and churches quickly, while another waited, hoping the outbreak would remain manageable, hoping the economy could keep moving, hoping that public fear would not do almost as much damage as the disease itself. But once influenza took hold, the same practical problems began to appear everywhere. People were too sick to work. People were too afraid to gather. Businesses could not function normally. Public offices slowed down. Hospitals overflowed. Telephone exchanges struggled. Streetcar companies lost crews. Newspapers printed death notices in columns that seemed to grow longer by the day. And all the while, the work of death, the most solemn work a community knows, began to overwhelm the people assigned to perform it. This is the part of the 1918 pandemic that is difficult to imagine from the safety of a century later. Illness did not only happen inside bodies, it happened inside systems. A factory is not a building that makes things by itself. It needs workers at benches, foremen on the floor, clerks in the office, men loading crates, women stitching, boys carrying messages, janitors sweeping at the end of the day, someone to run the boiler, someone to open the gates. A streetcar line is not only rails and wires. It needs conductors, motormen, mechanics, ticket sellers, inspectors, cleaners and passengers well enough to ride. A school is not only desks and books. It needs teachers, children, janitors, administrators, and parents who trust that sending children there is not an act of danger. A city is not streets and buildings. It is habits repeated by thousands of people. In 1918, influenza broke those habits one fever at a time. Imagine a factory district on a cold morning during the height of the outbreak. The men and women who can still work arrive with lunch pails and tired eyes. Some wear masks, some keep them tucked under the chin until someone with authority looks their way. The air smells of smoke, oil, damp wool and the disinfectant somebody splashed near the entrance because it seemed like the right thing to do. A supervisor checks names and sees absences spreading through the list. Not one or two, not the ordinary absences of a normal week, but whole rows of people missing. One man is at home with pneumonia, another is caring for his wife, a third died 2 days ago. A girl from the packing room is sick. 2 brothers from the machine shop have not come in. The office clerk who usually keeps the wage records is in bed. Someone says the plant cannot run the afternoon shift if more people fail to appear. Someone else says the war work must continue. That phrase, war work, mattered. The country was still at war through most of the worst autumn wave. Factories were producing uniforms, ammunition, machinery, ships, food supplies, and the endless material needs of a military power that had thrown itself into a European conflict. Workers were told their labour was patriotic. Missing work could feel like failing the soldiers. Employers were under pressure to keep production moving. Public officials worried that panic and closures would damage the war effort. But influenza did not respect patriotism. It entered war plants, shipyards, rail shops, packing houses, offices, laundries, and department stores the way it entered homes. A worker might arrive because he believed he had no choice, stand at his station with a headache, cough into a mask or sleeve, and leave by noon too weak to continue. By evening, 2 others might be coughing too. For working families, the stopping of work had immediate consequences. There was no broad modern safety net waiting beneath them, no automatic paycheck replacement, no federal relief system capable of catching millions of households in a health emergency, no guarantee that an employer would hold a job open kindly until fever passed. Some workers had union support, mutual aid societies, fraternal organisations, church funds, family networks, or employers who showed mercy. Many had very little. A missed week could mean unpaid rent. 2 missed weeks could mean debt at the grocer. A father sick in bed might be less frightening to his children if they did not understand the money, but the adults understood. A mother nursing him understood. The landlord understood. The coal dealer understood. The pandemic made the body a financial risk. This is why so many people kept moving when they should have stopped. A man with chills still boarded the streetcar because the family needed wages. A domestic servant went to a wealthy household because losing the position might mean losing a room as well as income. A store clerk stood behind the counter with a sore throat because the manager had already warned that too many absences could not be tolerated. A laundress took in washing from other people's houses because she needed the money, even though every bundle felt suspicious now. Public health advice told the sick to stay home. Economic life whispered, and sometimes shouted, that staying home could ruin you. Ordinary Americans were asked to protect the community while also surviving inside an economy that often punished caution. At the same time, some work stopped because officials ordered it to stop. Theatres closed, dance halls closed, night schools closed, public meetings were banned in many places, churches suspended services, saloons, pool rooms, lodges, and other places of gathering were restricted or shut depending on the city. These closures did not make streets empty in the way a snowstorm might. People still had to buy food. Workers still moved where work remained. Doctors, nurses, police, undertakers, delivery men, and volunteers still crossed the city, but the pleasure of the street disappeared. No crowd outside the theatre, no children in schoolyards, no music coming from dance halls, no church congregation moving together on Sunday morning. The city still functioned, but without much of what made it feel alive. For business owners, the closures were terrifying in their own way. A theatre owner could understand the danger and still stare at empty seats, like a man watching money drain through the floor. A saloon keeper might have barrels and bottles he could not sell. A barber might wait for customers who no longer wanted another man's hands near their face. A restaurant might stay open with fewer tables or close, because no one wanted to eat in a crowded room. A shop might lose clerks to illness and customers to fear at the same time. The newspapers sometimes carried complaints from businesses that the restrictions were too severe, or unfair, or unevenly enforced. Public health orders were written as if health were the only thing at stake. For the people whose livelihoods depended on gathering, health and money collided every morning when the door stayed locked. Even work that continued often became slower and more strained. The mail might still be delivered, but carriers wore masks and routes could be disrupted by illness. Telephone operators still connected calls, but exchanges were short-staffed, and the calls themselves were heavier now. Doctor, nurse, hospital, undertaker, pharmacy, relative, employer, health office. Police still patrolled, but they also enforced health orders, watched for mask violations, dispersed gatherings, and checked on households. Garbage collection, coal delivery, milk delivery, grocery supply, newspaper printing, all of it depended on enough people staying well enough to perform tasks that only became visible when they failed. A city discovered its own dependence by watching ordinary services falter. And then there were the funerals. At first, death entered the newspapers in the familiar way, through notices, brief and formal. Beloved wife of, son of, age 23 years, funeral private, interment at such and such cemetery. The language was controlled because death notices have always tried to make grief behave. But as October deepened, the number of notices grew, and the formality began to feel overwhelmed by repetition. The same word appeared again and again: influenza, pneumonia, suddenly, after a brief illness, private funeral, services omitted, burial at convenience of family. These small phrases carried entire rooms of suffering behind them. A funeral in ordinary times was one of the ways a community showed that a life had mattered. People came to the house, they stood beside the coffin, they brought food, they shook hands, they embraced, they followed the body to church or cemetery, they listened to prayers, they saw the family and allowed the family to be seen. During the pandemic, those rituals became dangerous or impossible. Public funerals were restricted in many places, services were shortened, attendance was limited. Some families could not gather relatives because travel was risky, restricted, or too slow. Some were themselves quarantined or sick. Some had more than one body to bury. To lose someone and then be denied the full shape of mourning was one of the pandemic's deepest cruelties. The undertaker became one of the most strained figures in the city. Undertakers were not merely businessmen. They were handlers of ritual, logistics, bodies, coffins, transportation, paperwork, cemetery arrangements, and family expectations. In normal times, they helped death move through the community in an orderly way. In 1918, the number of dead could rise faster than any orderly system could manage. Undertakers became sick too. Their workers became sick. Coffins ran short in some places. Embalming could be suspended or discouraged to speed burial. Cemeteries lacked enough gravediggers because some were ill and others were afraid. Bodies waited longer than families could bear. Philadelphia became one of the most terrible examples. After the large Liberty Loan Parade went forward in late September, influenza spread with horrifying speed, and by October the burial system was overwhelmed. Corpses waited for burial. Cold storage plants were used as temporary morgues. Coffins were scarce enough that packing crates from a trolley car manufacturer were used for some of the dead. It is a detail almost too harsh to hold in the mind. A city that had filled its streets with patriotic crowds soon found itself searching for places to keep bodies cool and boxes in which to bury them. That is how quickly public celebration could turn into public disaster in 1918. But Philadelphia was not the only place where death outpaced the ordinary machinery. In Baltimore, officials had to address funeral costs and burial logistics for poorer families. Workers were assigned to dig graves. Coffins had to be secured. In other cities, funeral homes filled, cemetery vaults held bodies waiting for burial, and gravediggers could not keep up. Some communities used prisoners, soldiers, municipal workers, or volunteers to help bury the dead. These were not scenes from some distant medieval plague. They happened in American cities with electric lights, newspapers, streetcars, telephones, department stores, and modern confidence. The pandemic did not carry people backward in time. It revealed that modern life was still fragile when too many people died at once. For families, the burial crisis made grief more practical and more brutal. Imagine a father dying at home after 3 days of fever. The family sends for the undertaker. The undertaker cannot come immediately. When he does, he is exhausted, perhaps blunt from overwork, perhaps gentle because he knows there is no time for gentleness later. The family wants a proper coffin. There may be none available at a price they can pay, or none available at all. They want a service in church. The church may be closed or attendance limited. They want relatives present. Relatives may be sick, quarantined, afraid, or unable to travel. They want time. The city is telling everyone there is no time. There were also abuses and people noticed them. When demand for burial services rose, some undertakers and grave diggers raised prices. In a moment of mass grief, that felt unforgivable. Newspapers reported public outrage over families being charged sharply increased prices for coffins, burials, or grave digging. We should be careful not to paint every undertaker as predatory. Many were overwhelmed, working under dangerous conditions, handling an unbearable volume of death. But emergencies attract both sacrifice and exploitation, and ordinary Americans in 1918 saw both. A family could be helped by one stranger and overcharged by another in the same week. The streets themselves became part of the mourning. Funeral wagons moved more often than anyone wanted to see. In some neighbourhoods, people saw more hearses than streetcars. A black wagon turning a corner could make conversation stop. Children watched from windows, counting without meaning to. Adults learned not to comment every time because there were too many. Houses displayed signs of sickness or mourning. Curtains stayed drawn. Doors opened briefly for men carrying the dead and then closed again. The city did not become silent exactly. No city ever becomes truly silent. But a different kind of sound took over. Wheels on pavement, church bells used more sparingly, footsteps on porches, knocks at doors, the creak of wagons, the low voices of people speaking in front of houses where someone had died. In working-class neighbourhoods, where houses stood close together and lives overlapped, the frequency of death made privacy difficult. A family could not hide the undertaker's visit. A child could not fail to notice when the woman next door stopped sitting at the window. A street knew when one of its own was gone. But because gathering was restricted, knowledge did not always become shared mourning. People knew and stayed away. They watched and did not enter. They sent food if they could. They left notes. They prayed at home. This created a painful kind of community, one built on distance. Everyone knew, but not everyone could come close. For immigrant families, mourning could be even more complicated. Funeral customs brought from Italy, Poland, Ireland, Russia, Mexico, Greece, or elsewhere might require wakes, prayers, extended family gatherings, specific religious rites, food, candles, music, or processions. Public health restrictions could cut those rituals short. Language barriers could make official orders hard to understand. Poverty could make coffin costs devastating. In some neighbourhoods, priests, rabbis, mutual aid societies, burial societies, and ethnic organisations tried to preserve what dignity they could. But the pandemic forced many families to accept burials that felt rushed, incomplete, or stripped of the customs that made death bearable. Black communities faced the pandemic's losses within the constraints of segregation. Hospitals, cemeteries, funeral services, and public relief were shaped by racial inequality. Black undertakers, churches, nurses, physicians, women's clubs, and mutual aid organisations carried a heavy load, often with fewer resources and less recognition. Funerals in black communities were important occasions of dignity and collective memory, especially in a society that denied dignity in so many other places. Restrictions on gathering and shortages of burial resources therefore struck at something deeply communal. Yet communities adapted, organising care and burial support as best they could, even when the wider city failed them. While funerals multiplied, work continued to fail in smaller ways. A grocery store might open late because the clerk was burying his mother. A school might remain closed not only because of health orders, but because teachers were sick or dead. A streetcar route might be reduced because too many crew members were absent. A newspaper might shrink its pages due to shortages of staff and advertising. A factory might post notices about returning to work while half its workers were still weak. A church might reopen and find its choir missing voices. The pandemic did not simply end a life here and a life there. It removed people from the positions they occupied in the daily pattern, leaving gaps everyone else had to work around. The economic strain reached into homes that had not lost anyone. A family might survive the flu and still struggle because wages had stopped. Savings, if they existed, vanished quickly. Grocers extended credit until they could not. Landlords varied. Some showed patience, others did not. Charitable committees tried to distribute aid, but need was enormous. Widows faced sudden uncertainty. Children lost wage-earning parents. Young adults who had supported younger siblings were gone. In some homes, the death of one person changed the entire future of the household. A 16-year-old might leave school permanently to work. A mother might take in laundry. A family might move in with relatives. Survival after the fever could mean rearranging life around the absence of the person who had paid the rent. There is a phrase that appears in many accounts of disasters, and it is easy to pass over because it sounds ordinary. Return to normal. But what did normal mean after the funerals? For a city, normal might mean schools reopened, streetcars resumed regular service, theatres lit their signs again, churches filled slowly, factories restored shifts, shops advertised holiday goods, and newspapers returned to war victory, politics, prices, and ordinary crime. For a family, normal might mean setting one fewer place at the table. It might mean walking past the closed bedroom door and not entering. It might mean a child waiting for a father who would not come home from the cemetery. Public normal and private normal did not return at the same speed. The silence of cities during the pandemic was never total, but it was memorable because it touched places normally defined by noise. School corridors without footsteps, theatres without applause, church buildings without congregational singing, offices with empty desks, factories with idle machines, streetcars with fewer passengers and more coughing when passengers did come. Even the celebrations around the end of the war, loud as they were, could not erase the quieter truth. Many people celebrated Armistice Day while influenza was still killing their neighbours. Flags waved above streets where funeral wagons had recently passed. Bells rang for peace while families mourned people who had not died in battle, but in bedrooms, barracks, hospitals, and crowded wards at home. That combination of war joy and pandemic grief made the emotional atmosphere of late 1918 especially strange. A mother might have one son safe from the trenches and another dead of flu in an army camp. A town might hang flags for victory while printing influenza deaths in the local paper. A factory might be praised for war production while its workers buried co-workers. A church might give thanks for peace with pews left empty by disease. Americans were asked to feel relief and grief at the same time, publicly patriotic and privately broken. Many did, because life rarely waits for one emotion to finish before bringing another. Workplaces had their own rituals of loss, a desk left untouched, a tool assigned to someone else, a locker emptied, a pay envelope never collected, a foreman announcing a death before the shift began, women at a sewing room whispering about the girl who had been laughing there last week, men in a rail yard passing a hat for a co-worker's family, office clerks wearing black armbands, teachers writing to families of students who would not return. These gestures were small, but they mattered because they acknowledged that the dead had been part of more than one household. They had belonged to workplaces, churches, lodges, clubs, classrooms, street corners and daily routes. Their absence changed the map of ordinary life. Children saw more than adults wish they had. They saw schools close and reopen. They saw adults wearing black. They saw funeral wagons. They heard names. They were told not to ask too many questions and then listened at doors. Some lost parents, siblings, teachers, classmates. Some were sent to relatives because their own homes had become too full of sickness or grief. Some returned to classrooms where desks remained empty. A teacher might try to resume arithmetic and spelling while everyone knew who was missing. There is a particular cruelty in asking children to return to routine after death has become visible to them. But routine was also what adults had to offer. Sit down, open your book, write the date. The world continues. The lesson begins. In the streets, people learned to read signs of recovery and signs of loss. A shop reopening meant someone was well enough to work or someone new had taken over. A mask coming off meant either confidence or impatience. A church notice announcing services again meant the health board had relaxed restrictions, or the congregation had insisted. A black wreath meant loss. A quarantine sign coming down meant relief. A house with curtains still closed meant uncertainty. The city became a text people read every time they walked outside. And then there were the people whose work placed them closest to death. Undertakers, gravediggers, cemetery workers, morgue attendants, clergy, nurses, drivers, police officers called to assist, municipal workers assigned to burials. They did not have the luxury of looking away. A gravedigger in 1918 might dig until his hands blistered, then return the next day and do it again. A minister might perform shortened services one after another, sometimes with little family present. An undertaker might move from one house to the next, seeing grief in different rooms until all grief began to share the same exhausted shape. These workers were not immune to fear. Some refused dangerous work, some demanded higher pay, some continued because there was no one else. Their labour forced the city to confront the physical reality of its losses. We often speak of death tolls as numbers because numbers allow the mind to hold what the heart cannot. But in 1918, before death became a number, it became a scheduling problem for families and officials. Where will the body be kept? Who will come? Is there a coffin? Who can dig? Can the cemetery accept another burial today? Can the funeral be held? Can relatives attend? Can the family pay? Can the body be moved safely? These questions are harsh, but they are part of the truth. A pandemic does not only produce grief, it produces logistics under grief, and someone has to answer those questions while grieving. For the living, the quiet city could feel both safe and frightening. Empty spaces reduced contagion, but they also made the danger visible. A closed theatre told you officials were serious. An empty church told you prayer itself had been moved into private rooms. A street with fewer children told you parents were afraid. A workplace with missing workers told you the illness had names. Some people found comfort in the quiet because it meant the city was trying to protect them. Others found it oppressive, a sign that life had been suspended by forces no one could fully control. Most probably felt both, depending on the hour. As weeks passed and cases began to fall in some places, pressure to reopen grew. People needed wages, businesses needed customers, churches wanted congregations, children needed school, cities wanted sound again. When restrictions lifted, streets filled cautiously at first, then more fully. Theatres advertised reopening, churches announced services, schools called children back, streetcars grew crowded again, workplaces tried to restore shifts. But reopening did not erase what had happened. It simply required people to move through the places where loss had occurred and act as if life could resume there. A factory could run again with fewer workers. A church could sing again with fewer voices. A school could teach again with fewer children. A family could eat again with an empty chair. This was the real beginning of recovery, not the moment the health board declared the danger reduced, But the moment ordinary people had to carry absence back into ordinary routines, they returned to work because they had to. They attended shortened funerals or remembered the ones they'd been unable to attend. They reopened stores. They washed mourning clothes. They paid bills. They wrote letters explaining who had died and who had survived. They read newspapers that began to move on before they were ready. The city grew louder again, but not in the same way. Under the streetcar bell and factory whistle and schoolyard noise was a knowledge people had not carried before. They knew now that a cough could close a workplace, a fever could empty a classroom, a public parade could help fill hospitals. A family could need neighbours more than pride allowed. Coffins could run short. Gravediggers could fail to keep up. A modern city could become fragile in a matter of weeks. That knowledge did not always become permanent wisdom. People are very good at forgetting what frightens them once the immediate danger passes. But for those who lived through it, the autumn of 1918 left a mark on the meaning of ordinary noise. And in the houses the work of continuing began. A widow counted money at the table. A recovered father returned to work too thin and too tired because there was no other income. A child put on school clothes and walked past the house where a friend had died. A mother washed the last sickroom sheet and folded it away. A neighbour who had brought soup now received a basket from someone else, because grief and care kept changing places. The public emergency was easing in some communities, but private recovery had only begun. The question was no longer only who would survive the fever. It was how the people who survived would live with the costs, the absences, the debts, the weakened bodies, and the memory of streets that had gone quiet while funerals moved through them. The beginning again did not feel like a beginning. That is one of the first things to understand. When the worst weeks of the 1918 influenza pandemic passed through a town or city, there was no single morning when everyone woke up and knew the danger had ended. No bell rang to announce that the house was safe. No official notice could restore the strength in a father's legs or fill the empty chair at a kitchen table. No reopening order could make a grieving mother feel ready to walk into church again. The world did not return all at once. It came back unevenly, awkwardly, with one school opening while another stayed closed. One streetcar crowded again while a family nearby still kept a feverish child in bed. One theatre lighting its sign while an undertaker's wagon passed 2 streets away. This was how ordinary Americans began again, not with confidence, but with errands. A woman went to the market for the first time after nursing her husband through the flu. A boy returned to school and found a desk empty. A clerk unlocked a shop and swept dust from a floor that had not seen customers in weeks. A minister opened the church doors and tried not to count too visibly the people who were missing. A factory worker stepped back to his machine with hands that still trembled from weakness. A widow put on a coat and went to ask about work because the rent was still coming due. A nurse who had spent weeks moving from house to house slept for 12 hours and woke with the strange guilt of someone whose body had finally forced her to stop. Beginning again looked like this. Small movements. Necessary movements. People walking back into the routines that had survived them and finding that the routines no longer fit quite the same way. The word recovery sounds clean when we say it from a distance. It suggests a line crossed, a fever broken, a patient sitting up, a family relieved, a city reopened. But recovery in 1918 was often a long, tired, uncertain thing. Many who survived influenza did not rise from bed restored. They came back thin, weak, breathless, easily exhausted, sometimes with coughs that lingered and made everyone around them listen too closely. A strong man who had lifted crates or worked rail lines before the illness might find himself dizzy after crossing a room. A young woman who had kept house for 6 people might have to sit down after carrying water. Children who had been feverish might return to play more slowly, watched by mothers who had learned that health could change in an afternoon. The body survived first. The household adjusted afterward. For working families, this weakness was more than personal. It was economic. A recovered man could be alive and still unable to work a full day. A mother could be grateful her daughter survived and still frightened because the laundry had piled up, the wages had stopped, and the grocer's bill had grown. A family could avoid burial costs only to face doctor bills, medicine costs, lost pay, and weeks of thin meals. The pandemic had taken time, and time was money for people who had very little of either. In houses where the main wage earner died, beginning again might mean the entire structure of life changed. A widow took in washing, an older child left school, a relative moved in. A family moved out of one home and into another because the old rent could no longer be paid. Survival did not always mean keeping the same life. Sometimes it meant accepting a smaller one. And then there were the homes where survival was mixed with absence. That is one of the hardest kinds of endurance. A family might have 5 people sick and 4 recover. The house would be called fortunate by neighbours because most of them lived, and perhaps it was fortunate. But inside that family, one person was still gone. The bed had been stripped. The funeral, if it could be called that, had been rushed or limited. The dishes were washed. The children were told to get ready for school. Life resumed around the shape of the missing person. In public, the family might be expected to be thankful. In private, they learned that gratitude and grief can sit at the same table and refuse to make room for anything else. Children carried the pandemic into the future in ways adults could not always see. Some returned to classrooms after weeks of closure and found the room both familiar and changed. The blackboard was still there. The map still hung on the wall. The teacher still called names, but some names were not answered. A teacher might pause too long after reading one. A child might look toward the empty seat of a friend and then down at his own hands. Lessons resumed because adults believed children needed normalcy, and they did. But normalcy after death can feel like being asked to step over something without looking down. Children learn to do it because children are often required to be braver than anyone admits. Some children did not return to school at all. The death of a parent or older sibling could shift the household economy overnight. A boy old enough to work might be sent to a shop, a farm, a delivery route, a mill. A girl might stay home to care for younger children while her mother worked. In a family already close to poverty, one death could shorten childhood. The pandemic created orphans, half-orphans, and children whose parents survived but were too weakened or impoverished to continue as before. Relief agencies, relatives, churches, orphanages, and community groups tried to respond, but the need was large and unevenly met. Behind every public number was a child learning new duties in a house that had lost its balance. Adults, too, had to learn new duties. A man who had never cooked much might have to manage meals after his wife died. A woman who had never handled the family's accounts might sit with bills and wages and rent notices, learning the hard arithmetic of widowhood. A grandmother might take in grandchildren. A sister might postpone marriage to help at home. A boarder might be asked to leave because a family needed the room for relatives. Or a family might take in a boarder because they needed the income. The pandemic rearranged households in quiet ways that did not always appear in official records. Census pages later might show who lived where, but they would not show the conversation at the table when everyone realized the old arrangement could not continue. In cities, reopening brought motion before comfort. Streetcars filled again because workers needed to move. Shops reopened because owners needed to sell and families needed goods. Schools resumed because children needed supervision and education, and parents needed to return to work. Churches held services again because people needed prayer, structure, and one another. Theatres reopened because people wanted to sit in darkness and look at something that was not a sick room wall. But returning to public life after a contagious disaster required a strange kind of trust. You had to stand near people again. You had to touch coins, door handles, railings, counters. You had to sit in a pew where someone else had sat. You had to hear a cough in a crowd and not flee every time. Ordinary life asked people to become less afraid before they were fully ready. Some became careless quickly. That is human too. After weeks of fear, masks, closures, and death notices, many people wanted to tear the whole experience off like a damp cloth and throw it away. They packed into celebrations when the war ended. They returned to amusements. They visited. They shook hands. They laughed louder than necessary. Some of this was denial. Some was relief. Some was the body's need for company after weeks of isolation. A community cannot remain in a state of emergency forever, even when danger has not entirely vanished. People tire of fear. They begin to bargain with it. They tell themselves the worst is over, and sometimes they are right, and sometimes another wave proves them wrong. Because the pandemic did not end neatly in the autumn of 1918. Influenza continued into the winter and beyond in many places. Some communities faced renewed outbreaks, some restrictions returned. Some families who had escaped the first wave were struck later. This unevenness made endurance harder. It is one thing to survive a short disaster. It is another to live through danger that recedes, returns, and leaves people uncertain whether relief is real. A town might reopen schools only to close them again. A family might relax after weeks of health, and then hear that a relative in another city had died. A nurse might think the worst work was behind her, and then be called back to another full ward. The pandemic moved like weather that refused to follow the calendar. Still, people built habits around it. They learned to recognise the signs posted by health departments. They learned which officials they trusted. They learned to keep certain supplies ready. They learned that masks could be put away and then taken out again. They learned to ask after neighbours more carefully. They learned that a closed school did not mean a holiday. They learned that a sick room needed air, water, clean cloth, and someone steady enough to keep watch. They learned that public health was not only something doctors did, it was something a household did with its cups, towels, windows, errands, and decisions. That lesson did not always remain at the surface of American memory, but people who had lived it knew. There were also changes in public health itself. Cities and states had been forced to confront how quickly disease could overwhelm hospitals, expose nursing shortages, disrupt communication, and turn private homes into emergency wards. Officials had seen that timing mattered, that crowd control mattered, that schools, churches, theatres and streetcars were not just parts of social life, but channels through which disease could move. They had also seen that orders alone were not enough. A quarantine notice did not feed a family. A mask rule did not replace lost wages. A public warning did not reach every immigrant household unless someone translated it. A doctor's advice did not help if no one in the home had the strength to carry it out. The pandemic taught a hard civic lesson. Health is not only medical, it is social, economic, domestic, and local. Ordinary Americans did not always speak about it in such terms. Most did not come away saying they had learned about public health infrastructure or social vulnerability. They said things like, "That was the year everyone was sick," or "We lost your uncle in the flu," or "Your grandmother never really got her strength back after that," or "The schools were closed and nobody knew what would happen next." Family memory preserved the pandemic in fragments. A photograph of someone who died young, a story about soup left on a porch, a nurse remembered by name, a father who survived but coughed every winter afterward, a baby born during the outbreak, a wedding delayed, a funeral nobody could attend properly, a mask found years later in a drawer, folded and yellowed, looking too small to have carried so much fear, and then, slowly, the country moved on. This may seem surprising given the scale of loss, but it is one of the most striking things about the 1918 pandemic. The war ended at nearly the same time. Victory claimed the public imagination. Soldiers came home, parades returned, political battles resumed. The 1920s approached with their machinery, music, automobiles, advertising, radios, movies, and appetite for speed. America wanted forward motion. The flu did not fit easily into the story the country wanted to tell about itself. It was not a victory. It did not end with a treaty. It had no single villain, no battlefield, no monument large enough to hold its grief. It had happened in bedrooms, wards, kitchens, barracks and streets. Much of its labour had been done by women. Much of its suffering had been private. So it slipped, not completely, but strangely into the background of memory. But inside families it remained. It remained in the way a mother watched a child's fever years later. It remained in the way a widow budgeted carefully, because she remembered how quickly security could disappear. It remained in the way nurses understood the next outbreak, the next crowded ward, the next emergency call. It remained in public health departments, in reports, in arguments about closures and masks and schools, in the institutional memory of what delay could cost. It remained in cemeteries, where stones from 1918 and 1919 stood close together, whole clusters of dates telling a story without narration. It remained in the empty spaces of families whose descendants were never born, because someone young had died before marriage, before children, before the ordinary future had a chance to unfold. This is one of the hardest parts of historical loss to grasp. The dead are not only the people who vanish. They are also the futures that vanish with them. The children not born, the marriages not made, the businesses not opened, the songs not sung in church by the person whose voice was missing, the meals not cooked, the letters not written, the jokes not told at family tables. A pandemic takes more than a body. It takes continuations. Ordinary Americans may not have spoken of it that way, but they felt it whenever a family line changed shape, whenever a room stayed quieter than it should have, whenever a younger sibling grew up without the older one who was supposed to guide him. Yet endurance was real. We should not make the story only sorrowful because the people who lived it did not have the luxury of becoming only sorrowful. They cooked, they cleaned, they went back to work, they reopened shops, they married, they had children, they planted gardens, they paid bills, they repaired houses, they attended church again, they sat in theatres again, they rode streetcars again. They argued about politics, they celebrated holidays, they complained about prices, they laughed. They did not do these things because they had forgotten. They did them because life required participation even after grief. Beginning again was not betrayal of the dead. It was how the living continued carrying them. In a small town, beginning again might look like the school bell ringing for the first full week after closures. Children arrive in coats, some still pale, some newly serious, some delighted simply to be out of the house. The teacher stands at the front of the room and sees every absence before she says a word. She has prepared lessons, but first, perhaps she says a prayer, or speaks gently about those who are not there, or says nothing because saying it would undo her. Then arithmetic begins. Not because arithmetic matters more than grief, but because arithmetic is what a school can offer. Order, routine, a page to turn, a problem to solve. Children bend over slates or paper, and the scratch of pencils returns to the room. In a city, beginning again might look like a streetcar at rush hour. The windows no longer all open, or perhaps some still are because old fear lingers. A few passengers wear masks. Most do not. A conductor takes fares with the practiced movement of a man who has done this for years and is tired of being afraid. Someone coughs. Heads turn, then turn back. That turning back is not indifference. It is practice. People learning to live near one another again. The car moves down the track past shops reopening, churches announcing services, posters from the war curling at the edges, and houses where curtains have finally been drawn aside. In a home, beginning again might look like a woman washing the last of the sick linens. She has already boiled them, scrubbed them, rinsed them, wrung them out until her wrists ache. Now she hangs them in the yard or near a stove watching the fabric pull straight under its own wet weight. These sheets held fever, they held sweat, they held fear. Soon they will be folded and used again because ordinary households cannot retire every object that has seen suffering. This is one of the plainest forms of courage in domestic life. To wash what has been touched by terror and return it to use. To let the bed become a bed again. to let the room become a room again. Another family begins again at a table. There is one place fewer, or perhaps everyone is still there but weaker and quieter. The meal is simple: soup, bread, potatoes, whatever can be afforded. Someone says grace. Someone mentions work tomorrow. Someone asks whether school will stay open. Someone coughs, and the room pauses before continuing. That pause may remain for a long time, but the spoon moves again. The bread is passed. The lamp burns. The family is still assembled, changed but assembled, and in 1918 that was no small thing. Nurses began again differently. Some returned to ordinary hospital work, though ordinary may have felt like an impossible word. Some continued public health nursing. Some carried memories of the pandemic into every future patient's room. They'd seen what happened when there were too few trained hands. They'd seen families saved by basic instruction, and families lost in isolation. They had seen that nursing was not only bedside tenderness, but logistics, sanitation, education, endurance, and judgment. The pandemic strengthened the case for public health nursing and better preparation, though recognition rarely matched sacrifice. Many nurses simply continued, because nursing is often a profession in which one emergency ends by becoming the next day's work. Volunteers too returned to normal life carrying strange knowledge. A woman who had delivered soup might go back to sewing circle and never speak much of the houses she entered. A motorcar driver might return to social duties with a memory of waiting outside infected homes while nurses worked inside. A teacher might resume lessons after checking on families in crisis. A minister might preach again to a congregation that had been thinned. These people had seen the underside of their communities. They knew which homes had no spare sheets, which children went hungry when parents fell ill, which neighbours came forward, which stayed away, which institutions helped, which failed. Such knowledge can be uncomfortable after the emergency. Communities often prefer to forget what their crises reveal, and what did ordinary Americans learn about survival? Not that people are always brave, they are not. Not that communities always unite, they do not. Not that suffering automatically makes societies wiser. History gives us too many examples to believe that easily. What they learned, if they learned anything, was more practical and more humble. They learned that care is work, that public health begins in private habits but cannot depend on private households alone, that a city is only as strong as the people who clean its rooms, drive its cars, answer its phones, staff its hospitals, deliver its food, and notice when a neighbour has gone quiet. They learned that grief can become logistical before it becomes emotional. They learned that survival is often not heroic in appearance. It is repetitive, tired, and necessary. There is something in that worth holding on to tonight. The people who endured the 1918 flu pandemic were not living in black and white photographs. They were not simpler than us. They were not sturdier by magic. They were ordinary people with bills, tempers, children, prejudices, loyalties, fears and routines they did not want interrupted. They argued about rules. They missed work. They helped one another. They avoided one another. They made soup. They sewed masks. They buried the dead. They reopened shops. They made mistakes. They tried again. The distance between them and us is real in medicine, technology and time. But the human centre of the story is close enough to touch, because when illness entered their homes, they did what people still do. They listened at doors, they checked foreheads, they counted breaths, they hoped for appetite, they watched for the fever to break, they worried about money, they waited for news, they trusted helpers when they could, they resented restrictions when they were tired, they longed for ordinary noise, they learned that a healthy morning is not a small thing, and when the worst passed, they did not step into a fresh world. They stepped back into the old one, damaged and familiar, carrying new knowledge in their bones. So imagine one last American evening after the pandemic's worst weeks have moved on from a town, not ended everywhere, not forgotten, just moved on enough that the street has begun to sound like itself again. A streetcar bell rings in the distance. Somewhere a church door opens for a small meeting. A child carries books home from school. A shopkeeper turns the sign in the window. In a kitchen, a woman pours broth into bowls. Not for a fevered patient this time, but for supper. The sheets are dry. The windows are closed against the cold. A newspaper lies folded on the table, still full of hard news, but not the only thing in the room. Someone laughs softly at something ordinary. Someone else tells them not to be too loud and then smiles because noise in a house can be a blessing. Outside, the world remains uncertain. It always does. But inside that home, for this one evening, the family is gathered. The lamp is lit. The breathing in the room is steady, and after everything Americans had seen in 1918, after the masks and the closed churches, the sick rooms and the funeral wagons, the nurses at the door and the neighbours leaving food on the porch, that simple steadiness was not ordinary anymore. It was the thing they had been fighting for the whole time,